I am Kendra, 35 years old. At my father's lavish retirement gala surrounded by Atlanta's high society, he pointed a microphone at me and announced, I was the family's uneducated freeloader with no future. My sister laughed. Her husband tossed me a $20 bill for cab fare. I did not flinch. I simply smiled, dropped my crystal champagne flute into an ice bucket, and walked out. They thought they had finally put the family embarrassment in her place. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one who owned the very company about to buy my father's failing business. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire in silence while your family prayed for your downfall. The crystal chandeliers of the Buckhead Country Club cast a warm golden glow over 300 of Atlanta's most influential figures. It was a sea of tailored tuxedos and custom evening gowns. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of appetizers. This was my father Calvin's retirement party from his real estate brokerage, a night designed entirely to celebrate his ego and his carefully curated image of perfection. I sat at the main family table near the front of the ballroom. Beside me sat my mother Brenda, her posture rigidly perfect, her smile practiced for the cameras. Across from me was my older sister Jada, the undisputed golden child. Jada was a senior partner at a prestigious corporate law firm, a fact my parents managed to insert into every possible conversation. Sitting next to Jada was her husband Trent, a white man who ran a logistics company and carried himself with the unearned arrogance of someone who believed he was the smartest person in any room. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored black suit. No flashy jewelry, no loud colors. I had learned long ago that trying to compete with Jada's theatrical displays of wealth only invited my mother's harsh critiques. The room quieted as my father tapped the microphone on the grand stage. He adjusted his silk tie and looked out over the crowd basking in their absolute attention. Thank you all for being here tonight. Calvin began, his deep voice projecting through the massive speakers. Looking back on 40 years in commercial real estate, I am reminded that a man's true legacy is not his bank account, it is his family. Polite applause rippled through the room. My mother beamed, lifting her chin. My father gestured grandly toward our table. I have been blessed. Look at my eldest daughter, Jada, a brilliant legal mind making partner before she turned 30. She and her wonderful husband, Trent, represent the very best of our family's ambition. They know the value of hard work, of higher education, of moving in the right circles. More applause. Jada offered a gracious, practiced wave to the room. Trent wrapped an arm around her shoulders, shooting a smug look across the table at me. I kept my face entirely neutral, sipping my sparkling water. I knew exactly what was coming next. This was Calvin's favorite game, the setup followed by the strike. But life is about balance, my father continued, his tone shifting from pride to theatrical pity. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. He pointed the microphone directly at me. And then there is my youngest, Kendra. The spotlight literally swung to hit me. Hundreds of eyes turned in my direction. Kendra took a different path, Calvin said, a harsh chuckle escaping his lips. No college degree, no real future. She decided community college was just too tough 15 years ago and gave up. While Jada is closing million-dollar legal deals, Kendra is still trying to figure out what she wants to be when she grows up. Just freeloading off the family name. But we love her anyway, even if she is our little uneducated charity project. Laughter erupted around the room. It was not polite laughter. It was the loud, echoing laughter of people who felt superior. My mother covered her mouth, giggling openly. Jada leaned her head against Trent's shoulder, laughing so hard her diamond earrings shook. Trent looked right at me and mouthed the word pathetic. This was supposed to be the moment I broke. This was the moment I was supposed to lower my head in shame, to absorb their public abuse like a sponge, to accept my assigned role as the family scapegoat. For 15 years, ever since I dropped out of community college at 20, to escape their suffocating control and predatory financial demands, they had used my lack of a formal degree as a weapon. They believed it made me permanently inferior. I did not lower my head. I did not cry. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the polished hardwood floor, a sharp sound that cut through the dying laughter. I picked up my crystal champagne flute. I looked directly at my father on the stage. I held his gaze until his smug smile faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of confusion. I raised the glass toward him in a mock salute. Then, without breaking eye contact, I turned my hand and dropped the full crystal flute directly into the silver ice bucket in the center of our table. The glass shattered with a loud, violent crack that echoed through the sudden silence of the ballroom. "Cheers," I said, my voice steady and carrying perfectly in the quiet space. "This is the last time any of you will ever see me." I turned my back on the head table and began walking toward the exit. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going. As I navigated the narrow spaces between the crowded tables, the whispers started. I could hear the harsh judgments of my parents' friends, people who had known me since I was a child. Always causing a scene, one aunt muttered to her husband. "Brenda must be so embarrassed. A community college dropout throwing a tantrum," a family friend whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "Such a shame. She never could measure up to Jada," another voice chimed in. I let their words wash over me. They were operating on outdated information. They were judging a version of me that had died a decade ago in a tiny, unheated apartment while I taught myself global finance and market acquisitions. I kept my eyes focused on the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom exit. I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the cool, humid Atlanta night air. The valet stand was quiet, positioned under a massive stone portico, illuminated by gas lanterns. I handed my ticket to the young attendant. "Just a moment, please," he said, sprinting off toward the VIP parking lot. I stood alone under the portico, taking a deep breath of the night air. The tension in my shoulders began to release. I had finally done it. I had publicly severed the final thread tying me to their toxic performance. "Hey, wait up." I turned to see Trent pushing through the country club doors. He adjusted his expensive jacket, a condescending smirk plastered across his face. He walked down the stone steps, shaking his head. "You really know how to ruin a good time, Kendra," he said, stopping a few feet away from me. "Calvin was just having some fun, but you always have to make it about you, do not you?" I did not respond. I simply looked at him, studying the arrogance that radiated from him. Trent ran a mid-sized logistics firm that my father had practically funded for him. He believed he was a titan of industry. Trent pulled his wallet from his inner jacket pocket. He flipped it open and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He stepped forward and tossed it at my chest. The bill fluttered down and landed on the stone pavement between my expensive heels. "There is some cab fare," Trent said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Since you do not have a real job, I know money is tight. Do us all a favor and just stay away. You do not belong in rooms like this. You never will. Uneducated people like you just drag down the family brand. Go back to whatever little hole you live in." I looked down at the $20 bill. Then I looked back up at Trent. I did not feel angry. I felt an overwhelming sense of amusement. He was standing on a trap door and he had absolutely no idea. I stepped forward, my heel narrowly missing the crumpled bill. I looked Trent dead in the eye. "You should really be more careful with your cash, Trent," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "The logistics market is incredibly volatile right now. You never know when you might need an extra $20 to keep the lights on." Trent frowned, his smug expression wavering for a fraction of a second. "What the hell are you talking about? My business is booming." Before I could explain exactly how wrong he was, a pair of brilliant LED headlights swept across the circular driveway. The deep, powerful hum of a high-performance engine filled the quiet night air. Trent and I both turned as a custom midnight black Mercedes Maybach glided smoothly under the portico. It was flawlessly polished, a masterpiece of automotive engineering that cost more than Trent's entire suburban house. The valet attendant practically sprinted around the front of the massive vehicle. He opened the rear passenger door and stood at absolute attention. He did not look at Trent. He looked directly at me and bowed his head slightly. "Your car is ready, Madam CEO," the valet said loudly and clearly. Trent froze. His eyes darted from the valet to the Maybach and finally back to me. His mouth hung slightly open. The color began to drain from his face as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. "Wait," Trent stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the car. "Whose car is that? Did you rent that? You cannot afford a rental like that. Who are you working for?" I did not answer him immediately. I slowly bent down and picked up the $20 bill he had thrown at me. I smoothed out the creases with deliberate care. I walked over to the valet and handed him the bill. "Thank you for keeping her warm," I told the attendant. "Thank you, ma'am. Have a wonderful evening," he replied, pocketing the cash. I turned back to Trent. He was completely rigid, his arrogant posture entirely dismantled by the presence of undeniable, overwhelming wealth. "I do not rent, Trent," I said, my voice echoing slightly under the stone portico. "And I definitely do not work for anyone else." I stepped into the luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. The cabin smelled of expensive leather and quiet power. I settled into the seat and looked out at Trent, who was still standing on the pavement, looking like a man who had just realized the building he was standing in was scheduled for demolition. I pressed the button to roll down the tinted window. "Oh, and Trent," I called out to him. He blinked, staring at me blankly. "Tell Calvin I loved his speech," I said with a razor-sharp smile. "It is always good to know exactly where you stand with people right before you buy them out." I pressed the button to roll the window up, cutting off whatever desperate question was forming on his lips. I tapped the partition glass. "Take me home, please," I told my driver. The Maybach pulled away from the country club smoothly, leaving Trent standing alone under the lights, watching the uneducated family disappointment drive away in a $500,000 car. The transition from the stifling environment of my family's expectations to the quiet solitude of my own vehicle felt like breaking the surface of the water after nearly drowning. I poured myself a small glass of sparkling water from the car's built-in cooler. For 15 years, they had controlled the narrative. Because I had refused to take out $60,000 in predatory loans for a business degree, I knew was useless. My father had cut me off and kicked me out. They told everyone I was lazy. They told everyone I was a failure. While Jada went to law school on my father's dime and married a man my father funded, I was working the night shift at a hotel front desk, reading financial prospectuses and studying market trends until the sun came up. I had started small, using my meager savings to buy deeply distressed commercial debt. I learned how to negotiate. I learned how to leverage assets. I learned how to be ruthless in boardrooms filled with older men who underestimated the quiet black woman sitting across from them. I built Vanguard acquisitions from a single laptop in a freezing apartment into a private equity juggernaut that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in regional assets. I did it entirely in the dark. I kept a decoy apartment in a lower-income neighborhood, a dilapidated rental I used as my official mailing address, just so my mother could occasionally send me condescending letters or drop off leftovers like I was a charity case. I attended their agonizing holiday dinners dressed in basic clothes, playing the part of the struggling middle-class dropout perfectly. I let them mock me. I let them feel superior, because I knew that true power does not need an audience to validate it. True power moves in silence. But tonight, Calvin had crossed the final line. Using me as a punchline to entertain his country club friends was the catalyst I had been waiting for. The performance was officially over. As the Maybach glided onto the highway heading toward the city skyline, I pulled out my secure work phone. I had a message from Valerie, my lead corporate attorney, and the only person who knew the full extent of my family history. "The Vanguard acquisition papers for Calvin's real estate brokerage are fully drafted," Valerie's message read. "He is desperate. We are ready to move on his commercial debts whenever you give the green light." I stared at the glowing screen. Calvin's legacy brokerage had been bleeding money for 2 years. He had over-leveraged himself trying to keep up appearances and funding Trent's failing business ventures. He was currently seeking a massive corporate buyout to save himself from total bankruptcy. He thought Vanguard Acquisitions was a faceless Wall Street firm run by an older white billionaire. He had absolutely no idea that the CEO of Vanguard was the daughter he had just publicly humiliated. I typed my response to Valerie. "The green light is given. Call in Trent's commercial loans on Tuesday. Let them bleed." I locked the phone and looked out at the glowing lights of the Atlanta skyline. The game had officially changed. They had spent a lifetime making sure I knew I had no seat at their table. Now I was going to show them that I owned the entire building. The morning sun was barely cresting over the Atlanta skyline when I instructed my driver to take me to the south side of the city. I sat in the back of the Maybach sipping a freshly pressed green juice, watching the luxurious high-rises of Buckhead slowly give way to the worn-down, forgotten neighborhoods of my youth. I was heading to my decoy apartment. For the past decade, I had maintained a cheap rundown rental unit in a deteriorating brick building. I never slept there. I only used it as a mailing address and a stage piece. It was a prop in the grand theatrical production of my family life. My parents needed to believe I was struggling. They needed to believe that dropping out of community college at 20 had condemned me to a life of poverty and perpetual hardship. It validated their choices. It made them feel superior. Keeping that crumbling apartment cost me less than $1,000 a month, which was pocket change compared to the multi-million-dollar deals I closed daily at Vanguard Acquisitions. But to my mother Brenda, that peeling paint and rattling window air conditioning unit were proof that she had been right all along. I knew with absolute certainty that after my exit from the country club the night before, she would not be able to resist coming to punish me. She needed to put the family scapegoat back in her place. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped into the cramped space. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of old cooking oil and damp wood from the neighboring units. I did not bother turning on the lights. I simply stood by the small kitchen counter wearing a casual but impeccably tailored cashmere lounge set that my mother would likely mistake for a cheap sweatsuit. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, heavy aggressive knocks rattled the thin wooden door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, demanding pounding of a woman who believed she owned the person on the other side. I walked over and pulled the door open. Brenda stood in the dimly lit hallway looking entirely out of place. She wore a pristine white designer trench coat, her hair freshly styled into a flawless silk press, and her lips painted a sharp, disapproving crimson. Her eyes immediately darted around the dingy apartment, her nose crinkling in performative disgust, before her gaze finally settled on me. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply reached into her expensive leather handbag, pulled out a thick sheet of premium ivory paper, and shoved it hard against my chest. I took a step back, letting the paper flutter to the scuffed linoleum floor. "Pick it up," Brenda demanded, her voice echoing shrilly in the narrow hallway. "Pick it up right now. You are going to look at every single line of that invoice, and then you are going to figure out how to pay it." I looked down at the paper. It was the catering bill from my father's retirement party at the Buckhead Country Club. The total printed at the bottom was $40,000. I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers, keeping my face completely blank. "You want me to pay the catering bill for a party I walked out of?" I asked, my voice calm and low, offering no emotion for her to feed on. "You ruined your father's celebration," Brenda snapped, stepping across the threshold and invading my space. "You made a scene in front of the entire community. Calvin has spent 40 years building a pristine reputation in this city, and you thought it would be cute to throw a glass and storm out like a spoiled child. People were talking, Kendra. People were whispering about us. You owe your father an apology, and you are going to pay that $40,000 bill to make up for the absolute embarrassment you caused this family." I could not help the small, humorless laugh that escaped my throat. "You know I dropped out of community college, Brenda. You have made sure the entire city knows it. You think a woman living in this apartment has $40,000 sitting in a checking account to cover your caviar and champagne." Brenda crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing with a familiar toxic contempt. "That is your problem, not mine. Maybe if you had stayed in school, you would not be living in this pathetic little box. Look at your sister. Jada is a senior partner at her corporate law firm. She just bought her third investment property. And Trent, look at Trent. His logistics firm is booming. He is expanding across the Southeast. Your father and I gave him the capital to expand because Trent actually knows how to work. Trent is actually doing something with his life. You are 35 years old and you have nothing. You are nothing." Her words hung in the stale air, heavy with the weight of 15 years of financial and emotional abuse. She had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle without even realizing it. They had funded Trent. My father, a proud black man who claimed to value hard work and legacy, had taken the wealth he built and handed it over to his white son-in-law, while simultaneously cutting off his own daughter to teach her a lesson. I remembered being 20 years old, sitting at their massive dining room table crying because I could not afford my textbooks. I had asked for a loan of just $500. Calvin had looked at me with cold, dead eyes and told me that giving me money was a bad investment. He told me I was a liability. He kicked me out of the house that same week because I refused to sign my life away on a predatory student loan for a business degree I knew was practically useless without connections. I had worked night shifts scrubbing floors at a corporate hotel just to afford ramen noodles and an internet connection so I could study the stock market. I starved while they wrote blank checks to Trent so he could play businessman. "You gave Trent capital," I said, testing the words on my tongue. "You funneled the family money into a logistics firm run by a man who thinks throwing a $20 bill at me is a display of wealth. Hi is your brother-in-law, and you will speak about him with respect," Brenda hissed, taking another step toward me. "Trent understands business. Trent understands what it takes to maintain the lifestyle this family requires. You do not understand anything except how to be a burden. Now pick up that invoice. I do not care if you have to take out a high-interest loan. I do not care if you have to work 3 minimum wage jobs until you are 60. You will pay for the damage you did last night." I looked at the woman who brought me into the world. I searched her eyes for any trace of maternal love, any hint of the warmth that a mother should hold for her child. There was nothing there. There was only the furious, desperate vanity of a woman who cared more about what her country club friends thought than she cared about my survival. She was not a mother. She was a warden, and I was officially breaking out of the prison she had built for me. I slowly bent down and picked up the thick ivory paper from the floor. I held it between my hands, feeling the heavy, expensive texture of the country club stationery. I looked Brenda dead in the eyes. I did not blink. I gripped the top edge of the invoice and pulled my hands apart in one swift, violent motion. The thick paper tore with a loud, satisfying rip. I placed the two halves together and tore them again. I let the shredded pieces of the $40,000 demand flutter to the linoleum floor, landing exactly where they had fallen the first time. Brenda gasped, her hands flying to her chest in genuine shock. She had expected compliance. She had expected tears. She had expected the broken 20-year-old girl she had thrown out of the house. She had no idea she was standing in front of a predator. "How dare you!" Brenda breathed, her voice trembling with a terrifying, unhinged rage. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat. You think you can disrespect us. You think you can just tear up our demands and walk away." "I am not walking away, Brenda," I said softly. "I am just standing here waiting for you to realize that you have absolutely no power over me. You have not had power over me for a very long time." Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly spite. The polished upper-class facade completely melted away, revealing the cruel, vindictive woman underneath. "You think you are so smart, Kendra?" Brenda snarled, her voice dropping into a vicious register. "You think you can just cut us off and live your little pathetic life without consequences? Fine. You want to play games? Let us play. Your father and I had a long talk with Jada this morning. You remember the trust fund your grandmother left you? The $200,000 you were supposed to receive when you turn 35 next month." I remained perfectly still. My grandmother had been the only person in the family who truly saw me. She had been a fierce, independent woman who started her own hair salon in the 70s and saved every penny she earned. Before she passed away, she had set up a trust fund for me, but she had made the fatal mistake of making Calvin the executor until my 35th birthday. It was the only financial tie I still had to them. "You are not getting it," Brenda said, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Calvin is having Jada draw up the legal paperwork right now. As the executor, your father has the legal right to sever your access to the trust if he can prove financial incompetence or a lack of moral character. And after your little stunt last night, Jada said it will be incredibly easy to prove to a judge that you are unfit to manage those funds. We are taking the money, Kendra. We are going to roll it directly into Trent's business expansion. You are being completely cut off." She stood there, breathing heavily, her chest heaving with the exertion of her own malice. She waited for the reaction. She waited for my knees to buckle. She waited for me to beg, to plead, to apologize for everything, and promised to pay the catering bill if they would just let me keep my grandmother's money. To someone living in this decaying apartment, $200,000 was a life-altering fortune. It was the kind of money that could buy a house, start a business, or change a destiny. Brenda knew that. She thought she was dropping a nuclear bomb on my entire existence. I looked at her and I felt a smile touch the corners of my mouth. It was not a defensive smile. It was a genuine, terrifying smile of absolute superiority. Brenda did not know that $200,000 was less than what Vanguard Acquisitions generated in the time it took her to drive from Buckhead to my decoy apartment. She did not know that I moved tens of millions of dollars before breakfast. She thought she was drowning me, completely unaware that I owned the ocean. I took a slow step forward. Brenda instinctively took a step back, her back hitting the wooden door frame. The air in the tiny hallway seemed to freeze. I looked down at her, stripping away the mask of the struggling dropout, allowing the cold, calculating energy of a corporate titan to radiate from my posture. "Keep the $200,000. Brenda," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly precise. "Take it. Have Jada draw up the papers. Have Calvin sign them. Take my grandmother's money and hand it over to Trent." Brenda blinked, her triumphant smile faltering. "What?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice so she had to lean in to hear the executioner's song. I said, "Keep the money, Brenda. You are going to need every single penny of it when Trent's logistics firm defaults on Tuesday." The color vanished from her face. Her perfectly painted lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She stared at me, trying to search my eyes for any sign of a bluff, any indication that I was just throwing out empty threats. But all she found was the cold, hard certainty of a woman who had already secured the victory. "Get out of my hallway," I whispered. I reached past her, grabbed the handle of the door, and pulled it open. Brenda stumbled backward into the exterior corridor, her designer trench coat brushing against the dirty wall. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to yell at me for disrespecting her. But her brain was too short-circuited by the casual, lethal way I had just dismissed her ultimate threat. I did not give her the chance to find her words. I stepped back inside the apartment and shut the door firmly in her face. I listened to the silence on the other side of the wood for a few seconds before I heard the slow, hesitant click of her heels walking away down the corridor. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my secure work phone. I opened my encrypted messaging app and found the chat thread with Valerie, my lead corporate attorney. Valerie was a shark in a tailored suit, a brilliant legal mind who had helped me navigate the treacherous waters of private equity without ever exposing my identity to the public. I quickly typed out a new directive. "Accelerate the timeline. Jada and Calvin are moving to sever my grandmother's trust to funnel cash to Trent. I want Trent's commercial loans called in by Tuesday morning. No extensions, no grace periods. I want his logistics firm pushed into immediate default. Let us see how good of a lawyer my sister really is." I hit send and locked the phone. I looked around the dingy decoy apartment one last time. The peeling wallpaper, the stained countertops, the rattling air conditioner. I had played the part of the family failure perfectly for over a decade. I had let them project all their insecurities and arrogance onto me while I quietly bought up the ground beneath their feet. The ambush had failed. The retaliation had officially begun. They thought they were dealing with an uneducated dropout who was desperate for their crumbs. They were about to learn that I was the architect of my own empire, and I was about to demolish their entire house of cards. The sound of the thick ivory paper ripping in half seemed to echo like a gunshot in the cramped, poorly lit hallway of my decoy apartment. The two torn pieces of the $40,000 catering invoice fluttered down, landing gently on the scuffed linoleum floor, right between my mother's designer leather heels. For a moment, time simply stopped. Brenda stared at the shredded paper at her feet, her chest rising and falling rapidly under her pristine white trench coat. She was entirely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of my defiance. In her world, in the carefully curated bubble of the Atlanta elite, where my parents reigned supreme, nobody told them no, and certainly not the daughter they had designated as the permanent family failure. When Brenda finally looked back up at me, the polished, sophisticated mask she wore for her country club friends had completely melted away. Her face was twisted into a tight mask of pure, unfiltered venom. She had come here expecting me to crumble. She had expected the terrified 20-year-old girl they had thrown out into the streets 15 years ago, the girl who used to beg for their approval. She wanted me to cry, to apologize for walking out of my father's retirement gala, to scramble for ways to pay a bill I did not owe just to get back in their good graces. Instead, I was looking at her with absolute unwavering indifference. And that indifference was driving her out of her mind. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat." Brenda breathed, her voice dropping into a vicious, shaking whisper. "You think you can just tear up our demands and disrespect this family. You think you can live your pathetic life in this disgusting little box and suffer no consequences for humiliating your father in public." I did not move. I did not raise my voice. "I am just standing here, Brenda," I said softly, "waiting for you to realize that you have absolutely no power over me. You have not had power over me for a long time." Her eyes narrowed in dark, dangerous slits. She took a step back, crossing her arms tightly across her chest as she prepared to drop what she believed was an absolute nuclear bomb on my life. "You want to play games, Kendra?" she snapped. "Fine, let us play. Your father and I had a long talk with your sister this morning. I assume you remember the trust fund your grandmother left you. The $200,000 you were supposed to receive when you turn 35 next month." I remained perfectly still, though a cold wave of disgust washed over my heart. My grandmother, Nana Ruby, had been the only person in our entire bloodline who actually understood the meaning of hard work. She did not inherit a real estate empire like my father. She built her wealth dollar by dollar, standing on her feet for 12 hours a day, running a beauty salon in South Atlanta. She was the one who taught me how to save, how to invest, and how to spot a bad deal from a mile away. Before she passed away, she had set up a trust fund meant to be my safety net. But Nana Ruby had made one fatal mistake. She had made Calvin the executor of that trust until my 35th birthday. It was the absolute last financial tie I had to my parents. "You are not getting a single dime of it," Brenda said, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Calvin is having Jada draw up the legal paperwork at her firm right now. As the executor, your father has the right to sever your access to the trust if he can prove financial incompetence or a lack of moral character. And after your little stunt last night, Jada assured us it will be incredibly easy to prove to a judge that you are entirely unfit to manage those funds." Brenda leaned in closer, her expensive perfume failing to mask the ugliness of her words. "We are taking the money, Kendra. We are going to roll your grandmother's money directly into Trent's business expansion. You are being completely cut off." She stood there breathing heavily, waiting for the devastating impact of her words to finally break me. To a woman supposedly living in a decaying low-income apartment, $200,000 was a life-altering fortune. It was the kind of money that could buy a house, start a business, or rewrite a destiny. Brenda knew that. She thought she was drowning me. She thought she was taking away my only hope for a better life. She had absolutely no idea that $200,000 was less than what my private equity firm generated in the time it took her to drive to my apartment this morning. She thought she was sinking my ship, completely unaware that I owned the entire ocean. I looked at the woman who brought me into the world. I searched her eyes for any trace of maternal love, any hesitation about stealing an inheritance from her own child to fund her wealthy, arrogant son-in-law. There was nothing. There was only the desperate vanity of a woman who cared more about punishing me than she cared about my survival. I felt a smile touch the corners of my mouth. It was not a defensive smile. It was a genuine, terrifying expression of absolute superiority. I took a slow step forward, forcing Brenda to instinctively step back until her shoulders hit the wooden door frame. I stripped away the mask of the struggling dropout, allowing the cold, calculating energy of a corporate titan to radiate through my posture. "Keep the $200,000, Brenda." I said, my voice smooth and chillingly precise. "Take it, have Jada draw up the papers, have Calvin sign them, take Nana Ruby's money and hand it straight over to Trent." Brenda blinked rapidly, her triumphant smile faltering as confusion clouded her eyes. She did not understand why I was not screaming or crying. What she stammered. I stepped closer, lowering my voice, so she had to lean in to hear the executioner's song. I said, "Keep the money, Brenda. You are going to need every single penny of it when Trent's logistics firm defaults on Tuesday." The color vanished from her face instantly. Her perfectly painted lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at me, her eyes frantically searching mine for any sign of a bluff, any indication that I was just throwing out empty, desperate threats. But all she found was the cold, hard certainty of a woman who had already secured the victory. "Get out of my hallway," I whispered. I reached past her frozen frame, grabbed the handle of the heavy wooden door, and pulled it open. Brenda stumbled backward into the exterior corridor, her designer coat brushing against the dirty, peeling paint of the wall. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation about Trent, to yell at me for disrespecting her, but her brain was too short-circuited by the casual, lethal way I had just dismissed her ultimate threat. I did not give her the chance to find her words. I stepped back inside the apartment and shut the door firmly in her face. I stood in the quiet of the entryway, listening as her hesitant, unsteady footsteps finally echoed down the corridor and faded away. I walked over to the cheap laminate kitchen counter and picked up my secure encrypted work phone. I opened my messaging app and found the chat thread with Valerie, my lead corporate attorney. Valerie was a shark in a tailored suit, a brilliant legal mind who had helped me navigate the treacherous waters of corporate acquisitions for years without ever exposing my identity to the public. I quickly typed out a new directive. "Accelerate the timeline. Jada and Calvin are moving to legally sever my grandmother's trust to funnel cash to Trent. I want Trent's commercial loans called in by Tuesday morning. No extensions, no grace periods. I want his logistics firm pushed into immediate default. Let us see exactly how good of a lawyer my sister really is." I hit send and locked the screen, watching the device turn black in my hands. The retaliation had officially moved from a concept into execution. For years, my family had propped up Trent as the ultimate businessman. They treated him like a genius because his logistics company had flashy trucks and a nice corporate office. But I knew the truth. Trent was a terrible businessman who survived entirely on nepotism and dangerous debt. When his company Apex Freight started bleeding money 18 months ago, Trent had been too proud to admit failure. Instead of downsizing, he took out massive high-interest mezzanine loans from a shadow lender to cover his operational losses and maintain his wealthy lifestyle. He thought he was outsmarting the system. He had no idea that the shadow lender he borrowed millions from was a subsidiary shell company entirely owned by Vanguard Acquisitions. I had bought Trent's debt for pennies on the dollar. I held the paper that controlled his entire life. And because his loans were structured with strict performance covenants that he was currently failing to meet, I had the legal right to call the entire debt due immediately. I looked around the dingy decoy apartment one last time. The peeling wallpaper, the stained countertops, the rattling window unit. I had played the part of the family failure perfectly for over a decade. I had let them project all their insecurities and arrogance onto me while I quietly bought up the ground beneath their feet. They thought they were dealing with an uneducated dropout who was desperate for their crumbs. They were about to learn that I was the architect of my own empire, and I was about to demolish their entire house of cards. Tuesday was coming, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. 2 days passed in quiet anticipation. I was sitting at a secluded corner table inside an upscale artisan coffee shop in Midtown Atlanta. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a simple silk camisole, looking completely at ease as I reviewed a quarterly risk assessment on my tablet. A ceramic cup of black espresso sat untouched near my right hand. The ambient noise of grinding coffee beans and soft jazz provided the perfect backdrop for what I knew was coming. Brenda had not kept her mouth shut. I knew she would not. Panic is a highly contagious disease, especially among people who build their entire identities on the illusion of wealth. She had rushed straight to her golden child to demand answers about my supposed threats. And right on schedule, the frantic targets of my retaliation arrived to put the family failure back in her place. The heavy glass door of the coffee shop swung open with such force that the brass entry bells clashed violently against each other. Several patrons looked up from their laptops. I did not look up. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso as heavy, aggressive footsteps marched directly toward my table. "What is your absolute problem, Kendra?" a loud, furious voice demanded. I slowly lowered my cup and raised my eyes. Trent was standing over my table, his face flushed a deep, blotchy red. He was wearing a navy business suit that suddenly looked too tight across his shoulders. His blonde hair was disheveled, completely lacking the polished, arrogant country club perfection he usually maintained. Beside him stood my older sister, Jada. She wore a sharp designer ivory pantsuit, her posture rigidly defensive. Her flawless silk press held its shape despite the humid Atlanta morning, but the dark circles under her eyes betrayed a deep, creeping exhaustion. Trent slammed his hands down flat on the edge of my small cafe table, leaning his upper body toward me in an overt display of physical intimidation. The sudden impact rattled my saucer, spilling a few dark drops of espresso onto the pristine white table. "I am talking to you," Trent sneered, lowering his voice into a harsh, menacing whisper so the barista would not hear him. "Brenda called Jada in absolute hysterics yesterday. She said you threatened her. She said you told her my company was going into default. Who do you think you are spreading these ghetto rumors about my business to your mother?" I looked at his hands, gripping the edge of my table with white knuckles, and then I looked up at his flushed, angry face. He was trying to bully a woman he believed was a broke community college dropout. He thought his sheer physical presence and his unearned authority as the successful white son-in-law would force me to cower. I leaned back in my chair, uncrossed my legs, and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. "Please remove your hands from my table, Trent," I said calmly. "You are vibrating with panic, and it is entirely unprofessional." Trent blinked, clearly thrown off balance by my complete lack of fear. He opened his mouth to shout again, but Jada quickly put a manicured hand on his forearm, pulling him back slightly. She stepped forward, taking on the role she loved playing the most, the brilliant, condescending older sister managing a deeply flawed sibling. "Kendra, this has gone way too far," Jada said using her authoritative courtroom voice. "Mom came to my house crying. She said you are living in a filthy apartment making up delusional lies about our finances just because you are jealous of our success. We know you are struggling. We know you are bitter that you never finished your degree and never made anything of your life. But trying to sabotage Trent's relationship with my parents is pathetic. It is a new low even for you." I looked at Jada. She was desperately clinging to the family script. She needed me to be the jealous, bitter failure, because if I was not, she would have to face the terrifying reality of her own life. "I am not jealous of you, Jada," I said, keeping my tone light, almost conversational. "I am actually quite fascinated by you. I am fascinated by how a senior partner at a top-tier Atlanta law firm could be so incredibly blind to the financial sinkhole she is currently living in." Jada scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Trent runs a multi-million-dollar logistics enterprise, and I bill out at $800 an hour. Our financial portfolio is flawless. You are just a dropout making up stories because you want to hurt Mom." I reached out and adjusted my espresso cup, aligning it perfectly with the center of the saucer. Then I looked directly into Jada's eyes, dropping the polite facade completely. "Your financial portfolio is a house of cards built on toxic debt and desperate vanity," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the sharp, lethal precision of a corporate executive holding all the leverage. "You do not have wealth, Jada. You have credit limits, and both of you have completely run out of runway." Trent let out a harsh, nervous laugh. "Listen to this. The girl who lives in a slum thinks she knows how corporate finance works. What did you watch a video on accounting?" I turned my gaze to Trent. The temperature at the table seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "Apex Freight has been operating at a 60% operational deficit for the past 18 months, Trent," I stated cleanly, reciting the numbers from absolute memory. "You lost your two biggest shipping contracts last year because your fleet is outdated and your maintenance costs skyrocketed. Instead of downsizing your operations or admitting failure to your investors, you tried to cover your losses with aggressive borrowing." Trent stopped laughing. His face went entirely slack. "But traditional banks would not touch you because your debt-to-income ratio is disastrous." I continued, leaning slightly forward. So you went looking for alternative capital. You took out a massive high-interest mezzanine loan from a private shadow lender just to keep up appearances. You used your commercial fleet as collateral. You have been pulling cash from that loan to pay your vendors, to pay your staff, and most importantly, to keep funneling money into your personal accounts so my parents would still think you were a genius. Trent took a slow step backward. The angry red flush on his face was rapidly draining away, leaving him looking pale and sickly. How he whispered, his voice cracking. "How could you possibly know those numbers? Those records are sealed." I did not answer him. I turned my attention back to my sister. Jada was staring at me, her mouth slightly open, her perfect posture crumbling as the reality of my words began to sink in. "And you, Jada," I said softly. "You are supposed to be the brilliant legal mind of the family, yet you let your husband leverage your personal assets to secure his failing business. You have 2 mortgages on your primary residence in Sandy Springs. You maxed out 3 different platinum credit lines just to furnish your second investment property, hoping you could flip it before the interest rates caught up with you. You are paying minimum balances on everything. You are floating your country club lifestyle on borrowed money, praying that Calvin's upcoming business buyout will provide enough cash for him to bail you both out before the banks notice." Jada gripped the strap of her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes darted around the coffee shop, suddenly terrified that someone might overhear the absolute demolition of her perfect life. "Shut up!" Jada hissed, her voice trembling with rising panic. "You shut your mouth right now. I do not know who you have been talking to or what kind of illegal corporate espionage you are involved in, but you are out of your mind. We are wealthy. We are successful. You are nothing." I smiled. It was a slow, predatory smile that made Jada physically recoil. "You are broke, Jada," I whispered. "You are drowning. And you have been so busy looking down on me that you did not even notice the water rising above your head." The silence that followed my words was absolute. For 5 agonizing seconds, the bustling noise of the artisan coffee shop seemed to completely fade away. Jada stared at me, her dark eyes wide, the flawless, arrogant mask she wore every single day finally cracking right down the middle. She looked like a woman who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting for gravity to pull her under. But Jada was a senior partner at a cutthroat corporate law firm. She had spent her entire adult life learning how to fight her way out of corners, and she had built her identity on being the smartest, most dominant person in the room. When faced with the terrifying reality that her financial secrets had been exposed by the sister she considered beneath her, her shock did not turn into humility. It curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed both of her hands flat against the small cafe table. The sudden violent impact rattled my saucer, sending a dark drop of espresso spilling over the rim. "Are you out of your mind?" Jada hissed, her voice shaking with a terrifying defensive fury. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to? I am a senior corporate attorney. I have ruined people for far less than this. You think you can sit here in your cheap little outfit and throw around numbers you do not even understand. You think you can try to blackmail us." I did not flinch. I did not move to wipe up the spilled espresso. I just kept my eyes locked on hers, watching the panic desperately trying to disguise itself as authority. Trent stepped closer, his heavy frame crowding my space as he tried to back up his wife. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at my face. "You listen to me, Kendra." Trent snarled, his voice tight and breathless. "I do not know what kind of low-level hacker you paid to get partial data on my company. I do not know what kind of ghetto bottom-feeding scam you are trying to pull on your own family. But you are playing a very dangerous game. My logistics firm is solid. We are experiencing a temporary cash flow adjustment due to aggressive expansion. That is what real businessmen do. But a dropout like you would not know the first thing about corporate strategy." Jada nodded quickly, clinging to Trent's pathetic rationalization like a life raft. "That is exactly right," she snapped, her chest heaving as she leaned further across the table. "You are a dropout, Kendra. You know nothing about corporate finance. You do not understand asset leveraging or operational capital. You are just repeating buzzwords you read on the internet to make yourself sound smart. But let me make this very clear for you so your uneducated brain can comprehend it." Jada took a deep breath, slipping into the aggressive, commanding tone she used to intimidate opposing counsel in mediation rooms. "If you ever speak those lies to our mother again, or to anyone in our social circle, I will sue you into absolute oblivion." Jada threatened, her eyes burning with malice. "I will file a civil suit against you for defamation, tortious interference, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I will bury you in so much litigation that you will spend the rest of your miserable life paying off my legal fees. My firm has partners who eat people like you for breakfast. I will take your cheap little apartment. I will garnish whatever pathetic minimum wage paycheck you are currently earning. I will make sure you are tied up in court for the next decade. Do you understand me?" I sat perfectly still, letting the full force of her legal tirade wash over me. She was throwing every intimidating phrase she knew, trying to bludgeon me into submission with her prestigious degree and her law firm's letterhead. She wanted me to cower. She wanted me to apologize, to admit I was just a bitter sister making up stories, to retreat back into the shadows and let her continue pretending she was a queen. I looked at Trent. He was nodding along with Jada's threats, a smug, relieved expression returning to his flushed face. He truly believed that Jada's legal threats had put me back in my place. He truly believed his failing business was safe. Then I looked back at Jada. I noticed the slight tremor in her hands where they rested on the table. I noticed the way she was breathing just a little too fast. I noticed the desperate, terrified plea hiding right behind her angry eyes. "If I am just an uneducated nobody making up stories?" "Jada," I said softly, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "Then why are your hands shaking?" Jada flinched as if I had struck her. She quickly pulled her hands off the table and crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face flushing with hot, angry color. "I am not shaking," she snapped, her voice pitching slightly higher. "I am furious. I am furious that I took time out of my billable hours to listen to a delusional failure try to extort my family. We are done here, Trent. Let us go. She is not worth our time." Trent sneered at me, adjusting the collar of his suit jacket. "You heard her, Kendra. We are done. Have a nice life at the bottom." They both turned to leave, fully intending to march out of the coffee shop and continue living their high-end delusion. They thought they had won the confrontation. They thought they had successfully bullied the scapegoat into silence. I reached down to my right side, unzipping the top of my handbag. It was a custom handmade leather tote that cost more than Trent's entire vehicle, but they were both far too blind to recognize true, understated luxury. I reached my hand inside and felt the smooth, heavy weight of the manila envelope I had placed there earlier that morning. I did not rush. I took my time, pulling the thick envelope from my bag and placing it flat on the table. I would not leave just yet. "Jada," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the cafe, with sharp, undeniable authority. "Not unless you want to explain to the State Ethics Board why you committed gross legal malpractice while advising your father on his corporate buyout." Jada stopped dead in her tracks. Her shoulders went completely rigid. She slowly turned back to face me, her eyes locked on the manila envelope resting on the table between us. Trent stopped beside her, a look of profound confusion washing over his face. "What are you talking about?" Jada whispered, the aggressive confidence completely drained from her voice. I reached out and opened the metal clasp of the envelope. I slid my fingers inside and pulled out a single pristine stack of legal documents printed on heavy linen paper. The top page featured a massive, unmistakable red stamp across the upper right corner. It was a formal notice of immediate foreclosure and a demand for the accelerated repayment of corporate debt. I placed my fingertips on the document and slowly slid it across the smooth surface of the cafe table until it stopped right at the edge, perfectly positioned for Jada to read. "I told you that your financial portfolio was a house of cards, Jada," I said smoothly, "but I did not tell you who was holding the fan." Jada stepped forward, her eyes dropping to the document. As a senior corporate attorney, she knew exactly what a legally binding catastrophic financial notice looked like. She recognized the format immediately. Her eyes scanned the bold black text. She saw the name of the private shadow lender that had been keeping Trent's logistics firm afloat. She saw the outstanding balance, a number so large it would bankrupt them 3 times over. Then her eyes moved down to the parent company listed at the bottom of the notice. Vanguard Acquisitions. And right beneath that, printed in sharp, undeniable ink, was the signature of the chief executive officer. It was my signature, my name. I watched the exact moment her reality completely shattered. The color drained from Jada's face so fast she looked physically ill. Her perfect, arrogant posture collapsed, her shoulders slumping forward as if an invisible weight had just been dropped directly onto her spine. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stared at the red stamp, her mind desperately trying to reject the impossible truth staring back at her. Trent leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the complex legal jargon. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice thick with renewed panic. "Jada, what does that say? What is Vanguard Acquisitions?" Jada could not answer him. She lifted a trembling hand and covered her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute consuming terror, as she finally looked back up at me. She realized in that one blinding moment that she had not been arguing with her dropout sister. She had been screaming at the billionaire who owned her entire life. "You cannot sue the bank." "Jada," I said softly, my voice calm, steady, and utterly victorious. "Especially when I own the private equity firm that just bought your husband's commercial debt. I am calling in the loan." It did not take long for Jada's carefully constructed reality to completely collapse. I knew my sister well enough to understand her survival instincts. She was a coward wrapped in a designer suit. The moment she realized her husband's logistics firm was in terminal default, and that I was the predator holding the debt, she did exactly what she had done her entire life. She ran crying to our father. Less than 24 hours after I left Jada and Trent, trembling in that coffee shop, the fallout arrived at my front door. I lived in an exclusive ultra-luxury high-rise in the heart of Buckhead. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and imported Italian marble designed specifically to keep the noise of the city out. The security was incredibly strict, requiring biometric scans and authorized guest lists just to pass the outer iron gates. But Calvin was a legacy real estate broker in Atlanta. He knew how buildings worked, and more importantly, he knew how to act like he owned a place he had absolutely no business being in. It was a crisp Thursday morning. I was standing in the expansive sunlit lobby, waiting for my driver to pull the Maybach around for my morning meetings. I wore a tailored crimson power suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, flawless bun. The lobby was a sanctuary of quiet wealth, featuring cascading water walls and plush velvet seating areas. The only sound was the soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. That pristine silence was violently shattered when the heavy glass revolving doors were shoved forcefully off their automatic track. Calvin marched into the lobby, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Brenda was right on his heels, clutching her purse to her chest, her eyes darting around the magnificent soaring architecture of the building with a mixture of awe and deep-seated panic. They had bypassed the outer security gates by tailgating a resident sports car, a desperate and reckless move just to hunt me down. Calvin spotted me standing near the concierge desk. His eyes widened, taking in my crimson suit, my posture, and the sheer, undeniable opulence of my surroundings. For a fraction of a second, I saw his brain short-circuit. This was not the decaying decoy apartment Brenda had visited. This was the pinnacle of Atlanta real estate. It was a building Calvin could only dream of selling, let alone living in. But his ego simply could not process the truth. Instead of realizing, he had vastly underestimated his daughter. His mind immediately defaulted to the most degrading, insulting explanation possible. Kendra, Calvin roared, his deep voice echoing aggressively against the marble walls. The sudden shouting caused several affluent residents to stop in their tracks. The sharply dressed concierge immediately reached for his desk phone, his eyes locked on the intruders. I caught the concierge's eye and gave a subtle, microscopic shake of my head. I wanted to hear this. I wanted to let Calvin dig his own grave. My father stormed across the lobby, closing the distance between us until he was standing mere inches away, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. Brenda flanked him, breathing heavily, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had broken into their home. "What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing?" Calvin demanded, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my face. "Jada came to my house last night in absolute hysterics. She showed me some fraudulent counterfeit foreclosure notice you handed her at a coffee shop. You printed out fake documents with a private equity firm's name on them just to terrorize your sister. I did not step back. I looked at his shaking finger, then calmly met his furious gaze. The documents are not fake. Calvin, I said, my voice perfectly level, lacking even a fraction of the emotional volatility he was projecting. Vanguard Acquisitions holds the debt, and I hold Vanguard. Calvin let out a harsh barking laugh that was entirely devoid of humor. It was the sound of a man trying to convince himself that the floor beneath him was not collapsing. You hold Vanguard, he mocked, his voice rising in volume, clearly intending to humiliate me in front of the lobby staff and passing residents. Do not insult my intelligence, Kendra. You are a community college dropout. You have no degree. You have no financial background. You could not even secure a basic bank loan when you were 20 years old. And now you want me to believe you run a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. He took another step forward, his face turning an angry, blotchy red. His next words dripped with a toxic patriarchal misogyny that he had always kept hidden beneath his polished community leader persona. I know exactly what is going on here, Calvin sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. I see the clothes. I see this building. You are not a CEO. You are a high-end sugar baby. You found some rich old white man on Wall Street to fund your pathetic little life, and now you are letting him use you as a front for his shell companies. Or worse, you are laundering money for criminals. That is the only way a dropout like you gets access to this kind of wealth. You are a fraud, Kendra. You are selling yourself to play pretend corporate executive. Brenda nodded vigorously behind him, emboldened by his cruel accusations. That is right, she chimed in, her voice shrill. You are a disgrace. We raised you to have morals, and you end up prostituting yourself to rich men just so you can rent a nice apartment and print fake business cards to scare your sister. I stood perfectly still, letting their venom wash over me. It was fascinating in a deeply tragic, almost clinical way. Calvin was a respected figure in Atlanta real estate, an elder at his megachurch, a man who served on philanthropic boards and gave grand sweeping speeches about Black excellence and building generational wealth. He loved the sound of his own voice preaching about empowerment. Yet when faced with the undeniable towering success of his own daughter, a success achieved entirely without his permission, his funding, or his guidance, he immediately reduced me to a caricature. He called me a sugar baby. He called me a money launderer. His fragile ego literally could not comprehend the fact that I possessed the intellect, the stamina, and the absolute ruthlessness to build an equity empire from scratch. He could not accept that the child he discarded had become a titan, while the children he coddled were sinking his legacy. You are projecting, Calvin, I said softly, my voice slicing through his arrogant shouting. You are drowning in toxic debt trying to bail out Trent's failing business, so you assume everyone else must be as financially compromised as you are. Do not you dare speak to me about debt, Calvin roared, completely losing whatever shred of composure he had left. He was practically vibrating with rage. I am a pillar of this community. I have spent 40 years building a pristine reputation in this city. I will not let some uneducated street-level escort drag my family name through the mud with illegal financial schemes. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone, holding it up like a loaded weapon. He was sweating now, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. I am calling the police right now. Calvin threatened, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings and drawing the attention of every passing resident. I am going to have you arrested for financial fraud, for corporate extortion, and for whatever illegal money laundering operation is paying the rent on this ridiculous penthouse. I am going to call the IRS and the Banking Commission. I will see you in handcuffs, Kendra. I will personally watch the authorities drag you out of this lobby in front of everyone. I will tear down this little fantasy world you have built just to save this family from the absolute toxic disaster you have become. You are going to a federal prison, and I will not spend a single dime of my money to bail you out. He stared at me, his chest heaving, waiting for the terror to set in. He expected me to lunge forward to beg him to put the phone away, to confess that it was all a lie, and ask for his forgiveness. He wanted to break me right there on the polished marble floor and restore the natural order of his universe, where he was the king and I was the peasant. I did not beg. I did not raise my hands to stop him. I simply tilted my head slightly and offered him a look of profound, chilling pity. Go ahead and dial. Calvin, I said, my voice completely devoid of fear. Call the police. Call the federal investigators. Tell them you want to report the CEO of Vanguard Acquisitions. I am sure they would love to look into the corporate filings. But while you are dialing, you might want to consider who actually owns the ground you are currently standing on. Calvin paused, his thumb hovering over the screen of his phone. His brow furrowed in confusion. Brenda looked around the massive, luxurious lobby, a sudden creeping sense of dread slowly replacing her arrogant anger. They had come here to ambush me, to corner me, in what they assumed was a rented apartment funded by illicit means. They were entirely unprepared for the reality that was about to crash down on their heads. Calvin stared at me, his thumb still resting uselessly against the glass screen of his smartphone. His eyes darted to the imported Italian marble beneath his expensive leather shoes, then up to the towering 30-foot ceilings of the lobby. He was a real estate broker. He knew the valuation of a building like this. He knew that the ground floor alone was worth more than his entire life's work. But his ego, rigid and suffocating, absolutely refused to let the truth penetrate his brain. He let out another harsh, dismissive scoff, shaking his head as if trying to physically dislodge the reality of the situation. You are out of your mind! Calvin spat, stepping forward again, trying to reclaim his physical dominance. You do not own anything in this building, Kendra. You are standing in a lobby you do not belong in, playing dress-up in a suit somebody else bought for you. You think because you read a few articles online you can stand here and pretend to be some corporate mastermind. I am not stupid. I know how the world works. A girl with no degree, no backing, and no family name does not just walk into a multi-million-dollar penthouse. You are a fraud. You are nothing but a high-end escort playing a dangerous game with men who will eventually discard you. I did not shrink under his intimidation. I did not lower my voice. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my hands relaxed at my sides. I let him hurl his misogynistic, degrading insults because they were no longer weapons that could hurt me. They were just the desperate, flailing actions of a drowning man. I remember the day you threw me out, Calvin, I said. My voice was calm, but it carried a sharp metallic edge that cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the cascading water walls. It was a Tuesday. It was pouring rain. I was 20 years old. I had just told you that I was not going to take out $60,000 in high-interest predatory student loans for a business degree that I knew was a trap. I told you I wanted to learn how the markets actually functioned instead of sitting in a classroom listening to outdated theories. Brenda stepped out from behind him, her face twisted with indignation. We gave you an ultimatum, she shrilled. We told you to follow the rules of this family. We built a standard of excellence and you spat in our faces. You brought that eviction on yourself. I did not bring it on myself, Brenda. I survived it. I replied, my gaze shifting to her before locking back onto Calvin. You packed my belongings into 2 cheap trash bags and tossed them down the front steps of your pristine suburban house. Do you remember what you said to me, Calvin? You stood on that porch looking down at your own flesh and blood, and you told me that without a piece of paper from a university, I would be entirely worthless. You told me I was a liability to your precious legacy. You said the world was going to chew me up and spit me out because I did not know my place. Calvin tightened his jaw, his eyes blazing. And I was right. You are standing here proving me right. You resorted to illegal, immoral behavior just to survive because you refused to listen to me. I shook my head slowly, feeling a deep, profound sense of pity for the man standing in front of me. You are so obsessed with credentials that you completely missed the education, I said smoothly. You worship the appearance of wealth, Calvin. You worship the country club memberships, the leased luxury cars, the tailored suits. You care about looking rich. I cared about actually being rich. My lack of a degree did not stop me from learning how money actually works in this country. It taught me that debt is a trap designed to keep the working class paralyzed while the elite use it as leverage. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Calvin actually flinched, his body betraying the fear his mouth refused to admit. While you were taking out second mortgages to fund Trent's failing business, just because he had a degree and the right complexion, I was scrubbing floors on the night shift to pay for financial textbooks. while you were throwing lavish parties to impress people who do not actually care about you. I was quietly buying up distressed commercial properties under a shell corporation. I did not sell myself to anyone, Calvin. I bought the system you worship. I bought the bank that holds your mortgage. I bought the private equity firm that is currently dismantling your son-in-law's entire existence. You kicked me out into the rain and I used the water to grow an empire. Brenda let out a small, terrified gasp. She looked around the massive lobby, finally realizing that no one was coming to throw me out. The concierge was not calling the police. The wealthy residents passing by were offering me polite, respectful nods. The horrifying truth was slowly sinking into her bones. Her uneducated, discarded daughter was the apex predator in the room. Calvin, however, was incapable of surrender. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He raised his phone again, jabbing his finger aggressively toward the screen. "I am calling the authorities," Calvin roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am putting an end to this delusion right now. You are going to be locked up, Kendra. I will not let you threaten this family." Before he could press the dial button, the heavy rhythmic sound of synchronized footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor. From the private elevator bank, the building's executive property manager approached. He was an older, distinguished man named Mr. Sterling, dressed in a flawless charcoal suit. Flanking him on either side were two massive, highly trained security guards, wearing dark uniforms and carrying themselves with quiet, lethal authority. They moved with absolute purpose, their eyes sweeping the lobby before locking directly onto the disturbance. Calvin saw them approaching, and a massive, triumphant grin broke across his flushed face. He let out a loud sigh of relief, lowering his phone and stepping forward to meet them. He completely believed that his loud, authoritative voice and his tailored suit would command their respect. He believed the system would always protect him. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Calvin said loudly, projecting his voice so the entire lobby could hear him playing the victim. "I am Calvin, the founder and CEO of Premier Heritage Real Estate. This woman right here is operating some kind of massive financial scam. She does not live here. She has property, and she is threatening my family with illegal corporate extortion. I demand that you detain her immediately and call the Atlanta Police Department. She needs to be removed in handcuffs." Brenda nodded vigorously behind him, pulling her coat tighter around her body. "She is dangerous," Brenda added, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "You need to get her out of this building before she hurts someone." I stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with absolute chilling serenity. The two armed security guards did not even glance at Calvin. They did not acknowledge his demands. They did not respond to his impressive introduction or his claims of being a respected community leader. They simply stepped around him, forcing Calvin to stumble backward to avoid being walked into. Mr. Sterling glided past my parents as if they were nothing more than misplaced pieces of luggage cluttering up his pristine lobby. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. Mr. Sterling offered a deep, respectful bow. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, beautifully bound portfolio bearing the gold-embossed crest of the property management group. He extended it toward me with both hands. "Good morning, Ms. Kendra," Mr. Sterling said, his voice warm, professional, and ringing with absolute deference. "I apologize for the delay. The final quarterly revenue portfolio for the building's commercial spaces has been updated for your review. Furthermore, the penthouse deeds have been fully finalized and recorded with the city. The entire top floor is officially yours." I took the leather portfolio from his hands, offering him a polite, gracious smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. Your efficiency is always appreciated." Behind him, Calvin looked like he had just been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open. His phone slipped from his loose grip, clattering loudly against the hard marble floor. Brenda let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, her hands flying up to cover her face, as the absolute magnitude of her colossal mistake finally crushed the air out of her lungs. Mr. Sterling turned slightly, his eyes briefly sweeping over my parents' frozen, horrified faces before looking back at me. He maintained his flawless, professional composure. "Shall I have security escort these trespassers off your property, Ms. Kendra?" he asked smoothly. I looked past the property manager, locking eyes with my father. All the arrogance, all the pride, all the unearned superiority had completely vanished from his expression. He was just a small, broken man standing in a building he could never afford, staring at the daughter he had thrown away. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," I said softly, but with enough clarity to ensure my parents heard every single syllable. "Please remove them. They are loitering, and it is terrible for the brand." The fallout from my morning in the lobby was swift and spectacular. When you sever the financial artery of people who live entirely on credit and arrogance, the resulting panic is a beautiful thing to witness. By Wednesday afternoon, my firm had officially executed the debt call on Trent's logistics company. The commercial trucks he leased were grounded, his vendor accounts were frozen. The shadow loans he thought were keeping him afloat had transformed into concrete blocks tied directly to his ankles. Jada was no better off. The moment Trent's business went into default, her pristine corporate lawyer facade began to crack under the weight of their shared liabilities. She had 2 mortgages on her primary residence and 3 maxed-out platinum credit lines. I knew from my financial analysts that Jada was frantically trying to move money around, desperately trying to protect her luxury vehicles and investment properties from the impending cascade of bank liens. But the most satisfying domino to watch wobble was Calvin. My father had spent 40 years building premier heritage real estate. He loved to parade around Atlanta as a self-made titan, a pioneer of Black generational wealth. But his business was a hollow shell. For the past 2 years, he had been quietly siphoning operational capital out of his own brokerage to fund Trent's failing ventures and subsidize Jada's extravagant lifestyle. He had over-leveraged his commercial properties, was bleeding cash. And now with Trent officially in default and Jada facing absolute financial ruin, Calvin was backed into a terrifying corner. He needed a massive immediate infusion of liquid cash to bail out his golden children and save his own legacy from public bankruptcy. Was drowning, so I threw him an anvil painted to look like a life raft. Through layers of corporate anonymity, my private equity firm, Vanguard Acquisitions, sent a formal buyout inquiry to Premier Heritage Real Estate. To a desperate man like my father, the offer looked like a divine intervention. Vanguard proposed a complete expedited acquisition of his brokerage, an all-cash buyout. The preliminary valuation offered him a staggering $10 million. It was more than enough to pay off Trent's defaulted loans, clear Jada's toxic debt, and leave Calvin with a comfortable multi-million-dollar retirement cushion. It was his ultimate golden parachute. Of course, Calvin had absolutely no idea that Vanguard Acquisitions was entirely owned and operated by the daughter he had just tried to have arrested in a marble lobby. He believed Vanguard was exactly what its corporate profile suggested, a massive faceless Wall Street conglomerate run by old invisible money. On a rainy Friday afternoon, I was sitting at my custom mahogany desk in my corner office, overlooking the gray, sweeping skyline of the city. My secure personal phone vibrated against the polished wood. I picked it up and saw a message notification from Calvin. It was the first time he had reached out since Mr. Sterling and the security guards had escorted him out of my building. I unlocked the screen. He had sent a high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of a sleek, heavy stock document resting on his country club dining table. I zoomed in on the image. The top of the page bore the bold silver embossed crest of Vanguard Acquisitions. It was the preliminary letter of intent for the $10 million buyout. Beneath the photo was a string of text messages, followed by a minute-long voice note. Calvin simply could not resist the urge to gloat. His ego, bruised and battered by his humiliation in my lobby, needed to reassert its dominance. He needed to prove to himself that he was still the king and that I was still beneath him. I tapped the voice note and put the phone on speaker, letting my father's deep, arrogant voice fill my quiet, glass-walled office. "I hope you are looking closely at that picture." Kendra Calvin's recorded voice boomed, dripping with a thick, condescending smugness. "I want you to take a really good look at what actual generational wealth looks like. You thought you really did something the other day, did not you? You thought your little property stunt in Buckhead was going to break me. You thought you could scare Trent and Jada with your little debt collection games. But you are just playing in the shallow end of the pool. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers together as I listened to the sound of a man eagerly walking into a slaughterhouse. You see, real power attracts real power. Calvin continued on the recording, his tone inflating with self-importance. Vanguard Acquisitions just approached me. I am sure even an uneducated dropout like you has heard of them. They are one of the biggest private equity firms on the East Coast. The CEO is a real titan of industry, a man who actually understands the value of a legacy business like mine. He saw my portfolio, and he knows what I am worth. They are buying me out for $10 million in liquid cash. $10 million. He paused, letting the number hang in the air, fully believing it would crush my spirit. Your little penthouse is a cute trick, Kendra. Calvin sneered, his voice dropping into a vicious, mocking register. But you will never reach my level. You will never have the kind of respect that brings a Wall Street billionaire to your doorstep offering an 8-figure buyout. By next week, the ink will be dry. I am going to take this cash, I am going to completely wipe out Trent's minor business debts, and I am going to secure Jada's future permanently. The family brand is going to be stronger than ever. So go ahead and keep playing your little corporate dress-up games in your apartment. We do not need you. We never did. I am untouchable. The voice note ended with a sharp click. The silence returned to my office, broken only by the soft, rhythmic patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked down at the phone. I did not feel angry. I did not feel hurt by his relentless need to tear me down, or his blind devotion to the children who were actively draining him dry. I felt a profound, almost clinical sense of amusement. Calvin's arrogance was so consuming that it completely blinded him to the mechanics of the trap he was standing in. I was so desperate to be the savior of his golden child and his white son-in-law that he was rushing blindly toward the $10 million payout. I was so busy celebrating his imaginary victory over me that he failed to ask the most basic fundamental questions about the acquisition. Why would a massive private equity firm offer an expedited all-cash buyout for a struggling regional real estate brokerage? Why were they pushing for the deal to close in less than a week? Calvin believed it was because of his stellar reputation. He believed it was because a phantom white billionaire recognized his brilliance. His pride was doing all the heavy lifting for me. He was practically tying his own noose and thanking me for providing the rope. I picked up my phone and stared at the photo he had sent. I did not reply. I did not need to. Arguing with a man who was sprinting toward a cliff was a waste of breath. I just needed to make sure the rocks at the bottom were sharp. I stood up from my desk, smoothing out the lines of my tailored trousers. I picked up my tablet and walked toward the heavy glass door of my office. It was time to finalize the kill. The preliminary contract Calvin had bragged about was just the bait. The actual binding acquisition documents were waiting in the next room. And I knew exactly how to ensure that Calvin, in his desperate rush to secure his $10 million golden parachute, would gladly sign away his entire life without reading the fine print. Valerie walked into my office without knocking. She was a brilliant legal strategist, a striking black woman who wore her natural hair in a flawless crown and carried herself with the precision of a military general. She had left a toxic male-dominated law firm years ago to help me build Vanguard Acquisitions from the shadows. She understood exactly what this moment meant, not just for our company, but for me as a black woman reclaiming her power from a family system designed to crush her. Valerie dropped a thick leather-bound folder onto the center of my custom mahogany desk. The bait was taken, Valerie said, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite my desk. She crossed her legs, a predatory, victorious smile playing at the corners of her mouth. He signed the preliminary agreements an hour ago. The ink is barely dry, and they are already asking our finance department how fast we can wire the funds. I opened the folder. The crisp white pages inside represented the absolute totality of Calvin's life work. Premier Heritage Real Estate was a staple in the Atlanta market, a symbol of excellence that he paraded around at every charity gala and church fundraiser. But looking at the internal financials Valerie had audited over the past week, the reality was a tragedy of ego. Let us walk through the execution, I said, leaning over the documents. Valerie leaned forward, pointing a manicured finger at the third page of the contract. Your father was terrified. When we officially executed the default on Trent's logistics company, the financial blowback hit Calvin's personal and business accounts immediately. He knew he had less than a week before the regional banks started filing public liens against his commercial properties. So when Vanguard offered the $10 million buyout, he did not negotiate. He did not ask for time to review the market. He did not counter-offer. He just grabbed the lifeline with both hands. And the severance protections I asked, tracing a line of dense legal text with my pen. Completely waived, Valerie confirmed, shaking her head in sheer disbelief at the legal incompetence on display. Our standard acquisition contract includes a standard corporate transition period, executive severance guarantees, and asset protection clauses for the founding owner. It is designed to protect legacy sellers from immediate liability, but those clauses require a mandatory 90-day auditing period before any funds can be dispersed. Calvin could not wait 90 days. Trent is drowning today. Jada is drowning today. So he asked for an expedited payout, I noted, observing his distinct sweeping signature at the bottom of the page. Exactly, Valerie said smoothly. He demanded the $10 million in liquid cash up front to be wired by this coming Monday. To get that immediate liquidity, our contract required him to waive all of his severance protections and standard seller immunities. He essentially agreed to hand over the entire brokerage with absolutely no safety net in exchange for a fast-track lump sum. I looked at the signature again. It was the signature of a man who believed he was securing a major historic victory. He believed he was outsmarting the market. Who reviewed this legal framework for him, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Valerie let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed against the glass walls of my office. That is the absolute best part of this entire disaster. He used his daughter. Jada acted as his primary legal counsel on the acquisition. She is the one who approved the waivers and pushed him to sign. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, absorbing the sheer poetic justice of the situation. Jada was a senior partner at a top-tier corporate law firm. She spent her days billing corporate clients $800 an hour, destroying smaller firms with ruthless litigation tactics. She was the golden child who never let me forget that I was just a community college dropout. But Jada was also a desperate woman, married to a failing white businessman, living a lifestyle she could no longer afford on credit cards that were currently declining at luxury boutiques across the city. Panic makes people blind. Calvin had handed Trent hundreds of thousands of dollars in seed capital simply because Trent possessed the aggressive confidence of a mediocre white man holding a business degree. Calvin wanted proximity to that privilege. He believed funding Trent elevated the family's status. And Jada was so desperate to get her hands on that $10 million bailout money to save Trent's logistics firm and pay off her own secret mortgages that her objective legal reasoning completely evaporated. She was so terrified of losing her country club memberships, her European vacations, and her status as the perfect daughter that she committed the most amateur legal mistake imaginable. She did not read the fine print. She rushed her father through the signing process because she needed Vanguard's cash in their accounts before her own house of cards collapsed. She missed the subsidiary liability clause entirely. Valerie said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute professional awe. It is a standard clause for expedited cash acquisitions. Vanguard agrees to purchase the brokerage for $10 million. But because we are waiving the 90-day audit, the seller agrees that any undisclosed debts, toxic assets, and subsidiary liabilities attached to the brokerage are immediately deducted from the final payout sum before the wire transfer is executed. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain wash over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. Calvin had been secretly using his brokerage's capital to guarantee Trent's massive shadow loans. The very same shadow loans that I had just forced into default earlier that week. Trent's toxic debt was legally tethered directly to Calvin's business, so I said, slowly, methodically mapping out the inevitable destruction. When the final acquisition triggers on Monday, Vanguard assumes full ownership of the brokerage. But we also instantly deduct the total amount of Trent's defaulted loans and Calvin's over-leveraged commercial mortgages directly from the $10 million buyout. Valerie nodded slowly, tapping the surface of my desk. When you calculate the penalty fees, the default interest, and the outstanding principal on Trent's logistics firm, Calvin's total liabilities exceed $11 million. The math was absolute. It was cold, brutal, and entirely legal. Calvin thought he was getting a $10 million check to save his family. But because Jada was too panicked to read the liability clauses, the $10 million would immediately be swallowed whole by the debts they had been hiding. His net payout will be exactly zero, I said, feeling a quiet thrill settle into my veins. Worse than zero, Valerie corrected, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a flawless corporate victory. Because he waived his severance to get the expedited cash, and the cash is entirely consumed by his own toxic debt. He is handing over complete ownership of his life's work to Vanguard Acquisitions, and he is walking away with absolutely nothing. No company, no retirement fund, no golden parachute. Jada literally guided her own father into corporate bankruptcy just to try and save her husband. I let the silence stretch across my office. For 15 years, they had told me I was financially incompetent. They told everyone I was a freeloader, a burden, a stain on their perfect legacy. Calvin had looked down at me from stages, from country club tables, from the porch of his pristine suburban home, and declared that I had no future because I lacked a degree. He had worshipped Jada because she had the right credentials, the right husband, and the right zip code. And now those exact same credentials had doomed him. His golden children had bled him dry, and his blind arrogance had convinced him to gladly sign his own execution order. Valerie reached into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer. She pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. It was the same pen we used to sign off on multi-million-dollar acquisitions that changed the economic landscape of the city. She placed it carefully on top of the final binding acquisition contract. The board meeting to finalize the transfer is scheduled for 9 in the morning on Monday, Valerie said, her voice steady and professional. Calvin requested to sign the final papers in person at the Vanguard headquarters. He wants to meet the CEO. He wants to shake the hand of the titan of industry who saved his legacy. I looked at the silver pen resting on the crisp white paper. I thought about the $20 bill Trent had thrown at my feet in the valet line. I thought about the $40,000 catering invoice Brenda had shoved into my chest in that decaying apartment hallway. I thought about the decades of emotional starvation I had endured while watching them feast on their own vanity. Calvin just signed the waivers, Valerie said softly, breaking through my thoughts as she offered a knowing smile. He thinks Vanguard's CEO is some faceless Wall Street billionaire. He has no idea he just handed you the keys to his entire life. I picked up the silver pen. The metal was cool and heavy against my skin. I did not feel any hesitation. I did not feel any lingering guilt or sadness for the family that had systematically discarded me. I only felt the profound, unshakable clarity of a woman who had built her own empire when she was denied a seat at their table. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my name. The Vanguard Acquisitions headquarters occupied the top 5 floors of a striking, ultra-modern skyscraper right in the financial heart of downtown Atlanta. I had designed the executive level to be a physical manifestation of absolute corporate power. The floors were imported black marble. The walls were structured from seamless soundproof glass, and the art collection featured original striking pieces from renowned black artists that commanded immediate respect. It was an environment built to intimidate the weak and challenge the strong. When you stepped off the private elevators onto my floor, you knew instinctively that you were walking into a financial fortress where billion-dollar deals were executed before lunch. On this particular Monday morning, the atmosphere on the executive floor was practically vibrating with quiet electric anticipation. My staff knew that a major, highly aggressive acquisition was being finalized today. What they did not know was the identity of the people currently sitting inside Executive Boardroom A. Only my lead attorney, Valerie, and my head of corporate security knew the actual names of the guests waiting down the hall. I was sitting in my private office, separated from the main boardroom by a long corridor of frosted glass. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that fit like a second skin, paired with a crisp white silk blouse. Valerie sat in the leather guest chair across from my desk, holding a secure tablet. "Turn on the internal feed," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Valerie tapped a sequence on her screen. The massive high-definition monitor mounted on the wall of my office immediately flickered to life. It displayed a crystal-clear live audio and video feed of Executive Boardroom A. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands on the smooth mahogany surface of my desk, and watched my family celebrate their own corporate execution. Calvin was sitting dead center at the massive 30-foot conference table. He had purposefully chosen the high-backed leather chair that was traditionally reserved for the acquiring CEO. It was a classic arrogant power move from a man who believed he was the most important person in any building he entered. He was wearing an expensive, flashy pinstripe suit that felt a decade out of style, completely unaware that true institutional wealth rarely needed to dress so loudly. To his right sat Jada. She was in full corporate armor, wearing a sharp designer dress, and spreading thick stacks of legal files across the polished table. She was playing the part of the brilliant senior partner, flawlessly highlighting documents with a gold pen and organizing the paperwork she had completely failed to read properly. To Calvin's left stood Trent. My white brother-in-law was pacing nervously in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the Atlanta traffic far below. Despite his attempts to project the relaxed confidence of a successful logistics magnate, I could see the distinct sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. He kept checking his expensive watch, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He knew his company was entirely underwater, and he was absolutely desperate to get his hands on the Vanguard buyout money. A junior associate, a brilliant young black man named David, who had just graduated at the top of his class from Morehouse, entered the boardroom carrying a silver tray with premium sparkling water and crystal glasses. David placed the glasses on the table with quiet professionalism. "Can I get anyone anything else while we wait for the executive team?" David asked politely. Calvin did not even look up at him. He waved his hand in a lazy, dismissive gesture, treating my highly educated associate like a servant at a country club. "Just leave the water and go tell your boss that Calvin is waiting," my father said, his tone dripping with condescension. "And bring me a double espresso. I do not drink this carbonated nonsense. Make it quick. We have a $10 million acquisition to close and my time is incredibly valuable." David maintained a perfectly neutral expression, offering a brief nod before turning and exiting the room. I watched the interaction on the monitor, a cold, hard knot of anger tightening in my chest. Calvin was so obsessed with status that he instinctively belittled anyone he perceived to be beneath him. He had done it to me for my entire life, and now he was doing it to my staff inside my own building. As soon as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind David, Trent stopped pacing and walked over to the table. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on the mahogany surface, staring intensely at his wife. "Jada, are you absolutely positive the wire transfer triggers by tomorrow morning?" Trent asked, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. "The shadow lenders are already moving to seize my commercial fleet. If Vanguard delays the payout by even 24 hours, they are going to lock the gates on my distribution centers. I need that cash in the business accounts today." Jada rolled her eyes, letting out a long, theatrical sigh, as if she were dealing with an annoying child. She picked up her gold pen and tapped it against the pristine white paper of the acquisition contract. "Trent, you need to calm down and stop acting so desperate," Jada scolded him, her voice echoing clearly through the audio feed in my office. "You are embarrassing yourself. I am a senior corporate attorney. I have reviewed every single inch of these documents. The agreement is airtight. Vanguard offered an expedited all-cash acquisition. The $10 million goes directly into Dad's accounts the moment the final signatures are recorded. Once the funds clear, Dad will wire the capital to your business accounts and your little logistics problem goes away entirely. You will be completely solvent by tomorrow afternoon." Calvin let out a booming, arrogant laugh, leaning back in my chair and crossing his arms behind his head. "Listen to your wife, Trent," my father boasted, his chest puffing out with absolute unearned pride. "I told you I would handle it. You just had a rough quarter, that is all. It happens to the best businessmen. But this is exactly why you marry into a family with real legacy. We protect our own. This Vanguard CEO, whoever he is, he took one look at my portfolio and knew he was dealing with a titan. He knows the value of my brand. That is why they bypassed the standard audit. They are throwing 10 million at me just to get my name on their roster. Trent let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He reached for a crystal glass of sparkling water, his hand shaking slightly as he took a long drink. Thank God, Trent muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. I am telling you, Jada, we were cutting it incredibly close. If this buyout had fallen through, we would have lost the house in Sandy Springs. The bank was already threatening to call in your secondary mortgages. We are not losing the house, Trent. Jada snapped, shooting him a furious warning glare. I handled the negotiations perfectly. I secured the bag. My credit lines will be completely zeroed out by Friday, and we can finally go back to living our lives without you having a nervous breakdown every 5 minutes. Calvin nodded approvingly, reaching out to pat Jada on the shoulder. You did brilliant work on this contract, Jada, my father said warmly. This is what a real education looks like. This is what a real degree gets you. Could you imagine if we had to rely on your sister for anything? Kendra is probably still crying in that filthy little apartment, wishing she had just listened to me 15 years ago. She is entirely worthless to this family. But you, Jada, you saved the day. After this wire transfer clears, I am going to buy that new boat I have been looking at, and we are taking a family vacation to St. Bart's to celebrate. I sat in my office watching the three of them toast their water glasses together on the high-definition screen. They were smiling, they were laughing, they were mapping out vacations to the Caribbean and celebrating their financial salvation. They were completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that they were sitting inside a perfectly constructed corporate slaughterhouse. Jada was bragging about her brilliant legal mind, completely unaware that she had just authorized the legal surrender of her father's entire net worth. Trent was breathing sighs of relief, totally ignorant of the fact that the shadow lender currently destroying his life was owned by the exact same company he was waiting to bail him out. And Calvin was sitting in my chair, insulting my intelligence, firmly believing that a wealthy white billionaire was rushing down the hallway to hand him a massive fortune. It was a masterpiece of arrogance. They were so blinded by their own vanity and their desperate need to maintain their upper-class facade that they never once stopped to question the reality of the deal. They never asked why. They only asked how fast. Valerie let out a soft, dark chuckle from the chair across from me. She looked up from the monitor and met my eyes. They really have no idea, Valerie whispered, her voice laced with absolute professional awe. Jada actually believes she won the negotiation. She literally read the subsidiary liability clause and completely ignored it because she was too greedy for the cash. They are sitting in your boardroom celebrating the destruction of their own lives. I looked at the screen one last time. I watched Trent adjust his tie, trying to look dignified. I watched Jada check her reflection in the glass of her phone screen. I watched Calvin check his watch, looking annoyed that the CEO was making him wait. They had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure. They had starved me out, mocked my ambitions, and used my struggles to make themselves feel powerful. They thought they had discarded me permanently. They thought I was a ghost they would never have to face again. I stood up from my desk. I buttoned the single center button of my tailored midnight blue suit jacket. I checked my reflection in the glass wall of my office. I did not look like the scared 20-year-old girl they had thrown out into the rain. I looked like a predator who had finally cornered her prey. Valerie stood up beside me, picking up her leather portfolio containing the final execution documents. She looked at her luxury watch and offered me a sharp, acknowledging nod. It is 9 o'clock, Valerie said smoothly. The market is officially open. Are you ready to meet your new acquisitions? I did not smile. I did not need to. I walked toward the heavy glass door of my office, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Let us go put the former management out of their misery, I replied. The walk down the executive corridor felt completely surreal. For 15 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's relentless disappointment. I had spent my entire adult life knowing that in their eyes, I was nothing more than a failed investment, a broken branch on their pristine family tree. They had mocked my intelligence. They had starved me financially. They had used my name as a cautionary tale at their elite dinner parties. But as I walked across the polished black marble floors of Vanguard Acquisitions, flanked by my lead corporate attorney and two highly trained security executives, I did not feel heavy anymore. I felt entirely weightless. I felt like a tidal wave about to crash over a sandcastle. The security guards moved with quiet, lethal precision, falling into step right behind Valerie and me. The ambient noise of the corporate office seemed to fade away, leaving only the sharp, rhythmic click of my tailored heels striking the stone floor. We approached the heavy double oak doors of Executive Boardroom A. I did not pause to gather my nerves. I did not take a deep breath to steady my heart rate. My heart was beating with a slow, calm, absolute certainty. I reached out and pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The heavy hinges swung silently, opening the space to reveal the sprawling, sunlit boardroom. The room was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, featuring a massive 30-foot mahogany conference table surrounded by black leather executive chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a visual reminder to anyone sitting in that room that they were currently standing at the absolute top of the city. Calvin was sitting directly in the center of the table, leaning back in his chair with his legs crossed, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. He was in the middle of telling a loud, boastful story to Trent, his hands gesturing grandly in the air. Jada was sitting to his right, smiling at whatever arrogant point our father was making, her perfectly manicured fingers resting casually on top of the acquisition contracts she had so eagerly failed to read. The moment the oak doors opened, Calvin's booming voice instantly cut off. The three of them turned their heads toward the entrance simultaneously. The silence in the boardroom was immediate and absolute. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The air in the room seemed to freeze completely. I stepped through the threshold, the tailored lines of my midnight blue suit catching the morning sunlight. Valerie stepped in right beside me, holding her sleek leather portfolio. The two corporate security guards stepped inside and took their positions on either side of the closed doors, crossing their arms over their chests and staring straight ahead with terrifying blank expressions. Calvin's eyes widened. He blinked rapidly, his brain violently rejecting the visual information it was receiving. He looked at my expensive, flawless suit. He looked at the powerful, confident attorney standing at my shoulder. He looked at the two armed guards securing the exit behind me. His mind desperately scrambled for an explanation that would allow his fragile ego to survive. He simply could not process the idea that I belonged in this environment of supreme corporate power. So his arrogance manufactured a delusion. He convinced himself that I was just a low-level employee who had somehow stumbled into the wrong room. Calvin let out a loud, incredulous laugh. It was a harsh, booming sound that completely lacked any genuine humor. He slammed his crystal glass down onto the mahogany table and shook his head, looking over at Trent with a look of supreme exasperation. "Well, look what the cat dragged in!" Calvin scoffed, his deep voice echoing aggressively in the large space. He turned his arrogant gaze back to me, looking me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Did you actually get a job in this building, Kendra? Did Vanguard hire you to push a hospitality cart around? Let me guess, they needed to fill a diversity quota for the mailroom, and you finally decided to get off your lazy behind and get a minimum wage paycheck." Trent let out a sharp, mocking snort. He leaned against the floor-to-ceiling windows, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with the exact same condescending smirk he had worn at the country club valet stand. "I guess the fake sugar baby lifestyle did not pan out," Trent sneered, shaking his head. "So now you are bringing coffee to real executives. You should probably turn around and walk right back out that door, Kendra. We are waiting for the CEO of this company to finalize a $10 million acquisition. You really do not want to be caught lingering in here when the boss arrives. You are going to ruin your little gig and get yourself fired." Jada stood up from her chair, her face flushing with hot, defensive anger. She was absolutely furious that I was standing in a room where she believed I had no right to exist. She saw my presence as a direct threat to the pristine upper-class image she was desperately trying to project to the invisible Vanguard executives. "Kendra, get out of this boardroom right now," Jada commanded, slipping instantly into her aggressive courtroom voice. "You are completely embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family. We are in the middle of closing a historic, highly confidential corporate buyout. I do not care if you work in the cafeteria or the janitorial department. You do not have the clearance to be on this floor." If you do not turn around and walk out that door this exact second, I will personally go find the Human Resources Director and make sure your employment is terminated before lunch. You are not going to sabotage Dad's deal just because you are bitter and desperate for attention. I did not say a single word. I did not react to Calvin's cruel insults. I did not flinch at Trent's smug dismissal. I did not entertain Jada's frantic, pathetic threats. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against people who are desperate for your submission. I simply began to walk. My heels clicked rhythmically against the black marble floor as I moved past the heavy oak doors. I walked past the row of empty leather chairs. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, my posture radiating the absolute undeniable authority of a woman who owned the very air they were currently breathing. Valerie walked a half step behind me, a slight predatory smile playing on her lips as she watched my family actively dig their own graves. Calvin's false confidence began to waver as I continued my approach. He expected me to shrink. He expected me to apologize and scramble out of the room. When I did not, his anger flared into a sudden volatile panic. He stood up abruptly from his chair, tossing his napkin onto the table. "I said get out!" Calvin roared, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of his rising fear. "You are trespassing on a private corporate meeting. I will not have my legacy disrespected by an uneducated dropout who cannot even hold down a proper career. Security. Remove this woman from the room immediately. She is harassing us." The two security guards standing by the door did not move a single muscle. They did not even blink. They answered to one person in this building, and it was certainly not the desperate sinking real estate broker shouting from the center of the table. I reached the head of the massive mahogany conference table. The seat at the head of the table was slightly larger than the rest, crafted from imported leather, specifically positioned to command the entire room. Calvin had placed himself right next to it, assuming the CEO would sit there and treat him as an equal. I stopped walking. I stood directly beside the executive chair. I unclasped my briefcase and placed it deliberately onto the polished wood surface. The soft thud of the leather briefcase hitting the mahogany table seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Jada stared at me, her dark eyes widening as a sudden horrific realization began to claw its way up her throat. She looked at the impeccable tailoring of my suit. She looked at the powerful corporate attorney standing silently at my side. She looked at the security guards who had completely ignored her father's commands. The math was finally starting to compute in her arrogant, panicked brain. Trent pushed himself off the glass window, his smug smile entirely vanishing. He looked back and forth between me and Calvin, completely lost. I placed my hands flat on the edge of the conference table. I looked directly into Calvin's wide, furious eyes. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. "I do not serve the coffee, Calvin," I said, my voice dangerously soft, yet carrying the lethal, undeniable weight of a corporate executioner. "I sign the paychecks. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I own you." The absolute stillness in the boardroom was suffocating. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody breathed. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, a steady mechanical drone that only amplified the sheer paralyzing shock gripping my family. Calvin remained frozen in his chair, his mouth half open, his eyes darting frantically from my face to the heavy leather briefcase I had just dropped onto his table. He looked like a man who had just been told the earth was flat. His brain simply refused to process the words I had spoken. Trent was the first one to break the silence. He let out a loud, forced bark of laughter, running a hand through his blonde hair as he looked over at my father. "This is a prank," Trent said, his voice loud and artificially confident. "Calvin, she is messing with you. She must know someone in the IT department here. She probably snuck up the service elevator just to pull some ridiculous stunt and make you sweat. Call security and have her thrown out before the real CEO walks in." Jada immediately seized on the explanation, her desperate ego clinging to any narrative where I remained beneath her. She slammed her hands down on the table and glared at me. "You are completely psychotic," Kendra Jada hissed, her voice trembling with indignant rage. "Do you honestly expect us to believe that a college dropout who lives in a slum is the chief executive of a multi-million-dollar private equity firm? You hacked the building access. You printed out some fake business cards. I am not just calling security. I am calling the Atlanta Police Department. You are going to be arrested for corporate espionage and trespassing. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I did not need to defend my position to a woman who was currently sitting inside my trap. I simply stepped to the side and gestured toward Valerie. My lead attorney stepped forward, her posture radiating absolute terrifying authority. She looked at Jada with the cold clinical assessment of a veteran prosecutor examining a hostile witness. "My name is Valerie," she said smoothly, her voice echoing with professional precision. "I am the General Counsel and Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard Acquisitions. And I can assure you, Miss Kendra is not trespassing. She is the sole founder, primary shareholder, and acting chief executive officer of this firm. You are sitting in her boardroom, you are drinking her water, and as of 9 o'clock this morning, you are officially occupying her property." Calvin gripped the armrests of his leather chair so tightly, his knuckles turned a mottled shade of gray. The blood was rapidly draining from his face. He looked at Valerie, recognizing the undeniable polish of a high-powered corporate attorney. Then he looked back at me, seeing me not as the daughter he had discarded, but as the predator who had just locked the cage. "That is impossible," Calvin whispered, his deep voice cracking under the weight of his rising panic. "I vetted this company. I checked the corporate registry. The managing partners are completely shielded through proxy holdings." "That is the beauty of private equity, Calvin," I said, taking a slow step around the head of the mahogany table. "When you build your own wealth instead of inheriting it, you learn how to protect your name. I spent the last 10 years buying up distressed assets across this city. I built Vanguard from nothing. And while you were busy telling your country club friends that I was a worthless failure, I was busy buying the bank that holds the mortgage on your precious real estate brokerage." I reached out and tapped a sequence on the sleek glass control panel embedded in the center of the conference table. The ambient lights in the boardroom instantly dimmed. The heavy motorized blackout shades silently descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into a cool, dramatic twilight. Behind Calvin, a massive 80-inch presentation screen descended from the ceiling and hummed to life. "Let us get straight to the business at hand," I announced, projecting my voice across the room. The screen illuminated, casting a sharp blue glow across their terrified faces. Displayed in massive high-definition text was the final binding acquisition contract for Premier Heritage Real Estate. At the very bottom of the projected document, blown up for everyone to see, were their signatures. Calvin's sweeping, arrogant signature sat right next to Jada's official stamp as his legal counsel. "You came here today to secure a $10 million expedited buyout," I said slowly, walking down the length of the table toward Jada. "You were desperate. Trent's logistics company, Apex Freight, went into terminal default yesterday afternoon. He is bleeding cash, his fleet is being repossessed, and his shadow lenders are preparing to seize your home in Sandy Springs by the end of the week." Trent jolted backward as if I had physically struck him. He looked at Jada, sheer terror erupting across his flushed face. "How does she know about the house?" Trent demanded, his voice cracking. "Jada, how does she know about the secondary mortgages?" Jada did not answer him. She was staring at the massive screen, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. Her perfect, arrogant composure was completely shattering in real time. She was finally starting to understand the magnitude of the disaster she had just authorized. "You needed cash immediately," I continued, stopping right behind Jada's chair. "You could not wait for a standard 90-day corporate audit. You needed Vanguard to wire $10 million into your accounts by tomorrow morning to save your husband from bankruptcy. And because you were so blinded by greed and so terrified of losing your country club lifestyle, you made the single biggest amateur mistake a corporate attorney can make." I placed my hands on the back of Jada's leather chair and leaned down, lowering my voice so she could hear every single syllable clearly. "You did not read the fine print, Jada." Jada let out a sharp, ragged gasp. She frantically grabbed the thick stack of legal files spread across the table in front of her. Her manicured fingers were visibly trembling as she ripped open the folder containing the final acquisition contract. She began flipping through the heavy linen pages with desperate, manic energy, her eyes scanning the dense blocks of legal text. Valerie stepped forward, holding a remote control. She pressed a button, and the image on the massive screen shifted. The projection zoomed in on Section 4, Paragraph B of the acquisition contract. The text was highlighted in a brilliant glaring yellow. "Let me save you some time, Counselor," Valerie said, her tone dripping with professional mockery. "Please direct your attention to the subsidiary liability clause. It is a standard provision for any expedited all-cash corporate buyout. But since you were apparently too busy planning your family vacation to St. Bart's to actually do your job, I will gladly summarize it for you." Jada found the page in her physical copy. Her eyes locked onto the paragraph. I watched the exact moment her breathing stopped. I watched her entire body go completely rigid as the horrific legal reality burned itself into her brain. By requesting an immediate, unaudited cash payout, Vanguard Acquisitions assumes full ownership of Premier Heritage Real Estate effective immediately, Valerie recited smoothly. However, the seller agrees that any undisclosed debts, toxic assets, and subsidiary liabilities currently tethered to the brokerage will be instantly deducted from the gross purchase price prior to the execution of the wire transfer. Calvin looked back and forth between the screen and Jada. His face was a mask of utter confusion and rising dread. "Jada, what does that mean?" my father demanded, his voice shaking. "What subsidiary liabilities? My brokerage is clean. I do not have any toxic assets." I walked away from Jada's chair and moved back toward the center of the room, making sure Calvin had a clear view of my face. "Your brokerage was clean, Calvin," I corrected him softly, "until you decided to play savior for your golden child. For the past 18 months, you have been secretly using your real estate brokerage as the primary financial guarantor for Trent's high-interest mezzanine loans. You tied your life's work to his failing logistics company. You cross-collateralized your commercial properties to keep Apex Freight afloat because you could not bear the thought of your perfect white son-in-law looking like a failure." Trent swallowed hard, stepping away from the table. His hands were shaking violently. "Wait," Trent stammered. "The mezzanine loans. You bought the mezzanine loans." I turned my gaze to him, offering a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "I am the shadow lender, Trent. Vanguard Acquisitions bought your commercial debt 6 months ago for pennies on the dollar. You have been paying me interest this entire time, and when you breached your performance covenants last week, I executed the default." I looked back at the massive screen and nodded at Valerie. The projection shifted one final time. It displayed a stark, highly detailed financial ledger. The numbers were massive, glaring, and absolutely undeniable. "Because Calvin guaranteed your loans," I explained, my voice ringing with cold, systematic authority. "Vanguard is legally required to absorb your defaulted business debt as part of this acquisition. And according to the contract, Jada just eagerly forced her own father to sign, Vanguard is legally authorized to deduct the total cost of your default directly from Calvin's $10 million buyout." Jada let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. The files slipped from her shaking hands, scattering across the polished mahogany table. She pressed both of her hands over her mouth, tears of sheer panic welling up in her eyes as she stared at the math on the screen. She realized she had not just failed as a lawyer. She had actively orchestrated her own father's total financial ruin. Trent stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. The realization hit him like a freight train. There was no bailout money coming tomorrow. There was no wire transfer. His business was dead, and the people he relied on to save him were going down with the ship. Calvin slowly stood up from his chair. His knees were shaking. He looked at the screen, then at Jada, and finally at me. The arrogant, untouchable real estate titan was gone. He was just a terrified old man watching his entire legacy evaporate into thin air. The massive high-definition screen shifted one final time, bringing up a stark, undeniable spreadsheet that sealed their fate. I watched Calvin stare at the glowing numbers, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He was a man watching his own execution in real time. The spreadsheet detailed the $10 million gross purchase price at the top. Beneath it, in bright red font, was the itemized deduction of Trent's defaulted mezzanine loans, complete with the exorbitant late penalties and breach of contract fees. Below that was the sum of Calvin's own toxic commercial mortgages, the ones he had secretly over-leveraged to keep his golden son-in-law afloat. At the very bottom of the screen, the final net payout was calculated. The number was 0. "Because you were so desperate for a fast cash bailout," I explained, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the boardroom, "you willingly signed away your standard severance protections. You waived the asset immunity clauses. You agreed to a raw, unaudited transfer of power. Vanguard Acquisitions is assuming your debts, Calvin. But we are paying for those debts with your buyout money. Your $10 million golden parachute just paid off my shadow lending firm. Vanguard now owns Premier Heritage Real Estate in its entirety, and you are walking away with absolutely nothing. Jada let out a loud, wretched sob. She buried her face in her hands, her flawless silk press falling forward to hide her absolute humiliation. She was a senior corporate attorney who had just guided her father into a legally binding, irreversible corporate bankruptcy. Her career was effectively over. Her reputation in Atlanta was destroyed. Trent stared at the giant screen, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The realization that there was no money coming, that his logistics firm was dead, and that his luxury lifestyle was officially over, finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity he had left. He spun around and turned his fury entirely on his wife. "You told me this was airtight!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking violently as he pointed a shaking finger at Jada. "You sat in our kitchen, and you swore to me that the money would be in our accounts by tomorrow morning. You said you read the contract. You said you protected us. You stupid, arrogant fool. You just signed away our entire life." Jada flinched, shrinking away from her husband. "Trent, please," she sobbed, her voice muffled behind her hands. "I did not know. I did not see the subsidiary clause. I was just trying to get the money fast enough to stop the bank from taking the house." Trent slammed his fist down on the mahogany table. "I do not care about your excuses. You ruined me. My fleet is gone. My company is dead. You were supposed to be the brilliant legal mind of this family. You are completely useless." I stood there and watched the spectacular, violent implosion of the perfect family. This was the man my father had bankrolled. This was the mediocre white man Calvin had chosen to invest in, simply because Trent possessed a degree and the right complexion to make Calvin feel like he had arrived in high society. Calvin had drained his own wealth, risked his legacy, and discarded his black daughter just to fund this man's arrogance. And the very second the money ran out, Trent turned on Jada like a rabid dog. Calvin could not bear to watch it. He slowly sank back down into the executive leather chair, his legs completely giving out beneath him. The proud, booming patriarch who had mocked me at a country club gala just days ago was entirely gone. He looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears of pure desperation. "Kendra, please." Calvin whispered, his voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. "You cannot do this to me. I spent 40 years building this brokerage. I built this legacy from the ground up. It is all I have. You cannot just take it and leave me with nothing. I am an old man. I cannot start over." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no sympathy. "You are not losing your legacy, Calvin," I said smoothly. "You already spent it. You spent it buying luxury cars for Trent. You spent it paying for Jada's country club memberships. You spent your legacy trying to buy the approval of people who are going to stop returning your phone calls the second they find out you are broke." Calvin reached out his shaking hands, grasping the edge of the conference table as if begging for a lifeline. "Kendra, I am your father," he pleaded, dropping his arrogant facade completely. "We are family. You have to stop this. You have the power to reverse the contract. You can forgive the debt. You have so much money now you do not need to take mine. Please just give me my retirement fund. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize. I will tell everyone how successful you are. Just please do not leave me on the street." The sheer audacity of his bargaining made my blood run cold. He was only sorry because he had lost. He was only acknowledging my success because I was holding the blade to his throat. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I leaned down, placing my hands flat on the table, bringing my face perfectly level with his. "Do you remember the night you threw me out?" I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal whisper. "Do you remember what I did when you tossed my trash bags onto the wet pavement? I begged you, Calvin. I begged you for a $500 loan just so I could buy my textbooks and eat something other than tap water and rice. I was your 20-year-old daughter standing in the freezing rain asking my wealthy, powerful father for the bare minimum of protection. And you looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a bad investment. You told me that business is ruthless and that family means nothing if the numbers do not make sense. Calvin squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping and rolling down his cheek. He could not look at me. The truth was too heavy, too absolute to deny. You wanted me to learn how the real world works, Calvin. I continued, my tone entirely devoid of mercy. You wanted me to understand that business is ruthless. Well, congratulations. You were an excellent teacher, and the numbers on that screen make perfect sense to me. I stood up to my full height. I buttoned the single center button of my custom-tailored midnight blue suit jacket. I looked at Trent, who was leaning against the glass wall, hyperventilating. I looked at Jada, who was weeping uncontrollably into her legal files. And finally, I looked down at my father, who was staring at the mahogany table in absolute total defeat. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the item I had specifically brought for this exact moment. I pulled my hand out and placed my fist over the table. I slowly opened my fingers. Resting in my palm was a single crisp $1 bill. I placed the dollar bill flat on the polished wood. I pressed my index finger against Washington's face and slid the bill across the smooth mahogany surface. It glided silently, stopping exactly 1 inch away from Calvin's trembling hands. He stared at the dollar bill, his face twisting in confusion and profound humiliation. "For the coffee," I said smoothly, letting the words ring out with crystal clear finality. "Since you demanded my associate bring you an espresso, I figured you might need some help covering the tab. You are going to need to start watching your expenses very closely." I turned away from the table, signaling the end of the meeting. I looked at my lead attorney, who was standing tall with a victorious smile radiating across her face. "Valerie," I said, my voice echoing with the absolute authority of the woman who owned the building, "have security escort former management out of my property. They are trespassing." I did not wait to watch the security guards step forward. I did not wait to hear Calvin's final desperate apologies or Trent's angry shouting. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I pushed them open and stepped out into the sunlit executive corridor, leaving them to drown in the shallow end of the pool they had built themselves. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom closed behind me, shutting away the frantic, desperate shouting that had already begun to echo off the glass walls. I did not pause to listen to the wreckage. I did not look back over my shoulder to relish the sight of their shattered egos. I simply stepped into the private executive elevator, the polished steel doors sliding shut and completely severing my physical connection to the people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. The descent to the ground floor was smooth and completely silent. By the time I stepped out into the bright, humid Atlanta afternoon, the legal machinery of Vanguard Acquisitions was already in motion. I had given the execution order. Now it was simply a matter of letting the math do its ruthless, inevitable job. The ensuing weeks were a masterclass in the cold, systematic dismantling of an empire built entirely on arrogance and credit. I did not gloat. I did not post cryptic messages on social media or reach out to mutual acquaintances to ensure the city knew what I had done. True power does not require an audience, and revenge is always best served as a quiet, legally binding contractual obligation. I handed all communication protocols directly over to Valerie and my corporate legal team. I instructed them to enforce the strictest possible boundaries. There would be no family meetings, no tearful mediation sessions, and absolutely no informal negotiations. Every interaction with Calvin, Brenda, Jada, or Trent was to be treated as a hostile corporate interaction. I became a ghost who owned their bank accounts. The financial reckoning hit, Calvin with the force of a high-speed train. Without the $10 million buyout money he had so desperately counted on, he had absolutely zero liquidity to cover the toxic commercial mortgages he had secretly guaranteed for Trent. The regional banks, sensing the blood in the water, moved with terrifying efficiency. Within 14 days, they filed public liens against all of Calvin's remaining commercial and residential properties. The pristine, sprawling suburban estate where I had grown up, the massive house where he had kicked me out into the pouring rain 15 years ago, was formally seized by the bank. He was given 30 days to pack his life into boxes and vacate the premises. The foreclosure was a public spectacle documented in the local business journals that Calvin used to read, like a religious text. The elite black business community in Atlanta is incredibly tight-knit and gossip travels faster than currency. The Buckhead Country Club, an institution that survives entirely on the illusion of limitless wealth, quietly revoked his membership due to outstanding dues and the sudden overwhelming stench of financial ruin. The man who had spent 40 years building a brand on the concept of black excellence, the man who had stood on a stage and mocked my lack of a degree, was systematically stripped of his kingdom. He was forced to relocate to a modest two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. There were no grand staircases. There were no crystal chandeliers. There was only the quiet, suffocating reality of a man who had sacrificed his own daughter on the altar of his ego, only to find himself completely bankrupt. Jada and Trent fared even worse. The implosion of their perfectly curated marriage was instantaneous and deeply volatile. When Vanguard Acquisitions officially absorbed and subsequently liquidated Apex Freight, Trent lost everything. The repossession companies arrived at his distribution centers before the week was over, hooking up his leased commercial fleet and towing away the last physical remnants of his unearned confidence. His logistics empire evaporated into thin air, leaving him with nothing but millions in outstanding shadow debt that he could never ever repay. His white privilege and aggressive arrogance could not save him from a ledger that proved he was a terrible businessman. I immediately blamed Jada. He screamed that her legal incompetence had doomed them, conveniently forgetting that his own disastrous operational choices were the root cause of the crisis. Jada fired back, her own world violently collapsing around her. The secondary mortgages on their luxury Sandy Springs home were officially called in. Her platinum credit cards were frozen, declining at grocery stores and luxury gas stations across the city. The repo men arrived at their driveway in the middle of the night to tow away their leased luxury SUVs. But the most devastating blow to Jada was not the loss of her designer wardrobe or her imported vehicles. It was the absolute destruction of her professional reputation. The details of the Vanguard buyout, specifically the subsidiary liability clauses that she had completely failed to read before advising her father to sign, became an open secret in the Atlanta legal community. The senior partners at her elite corporate law firm summoned her for a closed-door disciplinary meeting. While the exact details of that conversation remained legally sealed, Jada was quietly asked to clear out her office and take an indefinite leave of absence, effectively ending her fast-track career. Stripped of her money, her elite status, and her unearned superiority, Jada turned her bitter, suffocating anger entirely onto Trent. Their pristine marriage crumbled into a toxic battlefield of mutual resentment, screaming matches, and impending bankruptcy filings. They were drowning together, fighting each other over the last scraps of driftwood. Through all of this chaos, Brenda was the one who panicked the most. She had spent her entire adult life insulating herself from the harsh realities of the world by hiding behind Calvin's money and Jada's prestige. She was a woman who defined her own worth entirely by her proximity to power and the envy of her peers. And suddenly she found herself standing in a cramped, unremarkable apartment, married to a broke, disgraced real estate broker, with her golden children facing total financial ruin. The wealthy friends stopped returning her calls. The charity board members politely asked her to step down to avoid negative associations. The protective bubble she had lived in violently popped, leaving her completely exposed to the elements. Desperation makes arrogant people abandon their pride. In the third week following the boardroom confrontation, my secure personal phone began to register blocked calls. When I did not answer, the voicemails started arriving. I sat in my penthouse office looking out over the glittering city lights and played the audio messages on speaker. Brenda's voice filled the quiet room. It was not the sharp, aggressive tone she had used when she shoved the $40,000 catering invoice into my chest in that decaying hallway. It was the high-pitched, wavering, broken voice of a woman who had finally realized she was entirely powerless. "Kendra, please pick up the phone." Brenda sobbed on the first recording, her breath catching raggedly in her throat. "You have to stop this. Your father is sick with stress. His blood pressure is dangerously high. We had to leave the house today. Jada is crying every single night because Trent is packing his bags. We are your family, Kendra. We are your blood. You cannot just destroy us and walk away like we mean nothing. Please, we need to talk. We need to fix this. We can be a real family again. I am begging you. The messages continued arriving day after day in a pathetic stream of digital desperation. She pleaded for family unity, a concept she had never cared about until she was the one on the outside looking in. She claimed that she had always loved me, that she had just been tough on me to make me stronger. She offered hollow, desperate apologies that meant absolutely nothing because they were born entirely from financial terror, not genuine remorse. She thought she could manipulate my emotions. She thought the 20-year-old girl who used to crave her mother's affection was still somewhere inside me, ready to forgive decades of abuse just to be accepted back into the fold. I listened to every single voicemail with complete, unwavering detachment. I felt no urge to call her back and scream at her. I felt no desire to explain my pain or gloat over her sudden, devastating misfortune. True closure does not require a final argument. It only requires distance. I simply downloaded the audio files, attached them to a brief, highly encrypted email, and sent them directly to Valerie. My instructions were simple and final. Have the legal team draft a formal cease and desist order. Send it via certified mail and process server directly to their new apartment. If Brenda attempts to contact me, my staff, or my companies again, file for an immediate restraining order on the grounds of harassment. I locked my phone and set it down on the smooth surface of my mahogany desk. The silence in my penthouse was beautiful, deep, and incredibly peaceful. I had executed the consequences flawlessly. The past was officially dead, and I had absolutely no intention of attending the funeral. 2 months passed. The transition from spring to early summer in Atlanta brought a heavy, fragrant warmth to the evening air. I was standing on the sprawling private terrace of my Buckhead penthouse, listening to the soft melodic sounds of a live jazz trio I had hired for the evening. The terrace was an architectural masterpiece, featuring a massive infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the glittering city skyline below. Lush imported greenery framed the outdoor dining area, where a long table crafted from reclaimed dark walnut was set with fine crystal and minimalist, elegant floral arrangements. This was not a country club gala. There were no flashing cameras, no local society reporters, and absolutely no performative speeches designed to mask a crumbling financial reality. There was only the quiet, undeniable hum of genuine security. I was hosting an intimate dinner party to celebrate the close of our most profitable fiscal quarter to date. But more importantly, I was celebrating the people who had actually helped me build Vanguard Acquisitions. I looked around the table at my chosen family. These were the people who had stood by me when I was nothing more than a quiet, fiercely determined woman working out of coffee shops and hotel lobbies. Valerie sat near the center of the table, her corporate armor traded for a stunning, flowing emerald silk dress. She was laughing freely, her head thrown back as she shared a story with David, the brilliant young associate from Morehouse, who had expertly served my father that glass of water in the boardroom. David had just been promoted to senior acquisitions analyst, and he was currently holding a glass of sparkling cider, hanging on to Valerie's every word. Sitting across from them was Silas, a retired commercial investment banker. Silas was a sharp, perceptive black man in his late 60s who had taken a chance on me a decade ago. When I was just 25 years old, trying to secure my very first leverage buyout, Silas was the only executive in the city who looked past my lack of a university degree. He had looked at my financial models, recognized my absolute obsession with market mechanics, and quietly mentored me on how to navigate the predatory waters of private equity. He was more of a father to me in those few years than Calvin had ever been in my entire life. I watched them interact. There was no underlying tension. There was no desperate need to one-up each other, no subtle insults disguised as jokes, and no fear of stepping out of line. It was a table full of brilliant, successful, self-made individuals who respected each other entirely. It was the exact opposite of every suffocating holiday dinner I had ever been forced to endure with my blood relatives. My private chef, a remarkable culinary artist, I had flown in from New Orleans, began clearing the plates from our main course. The scent of seared sea bass and roasted asparagus was slowly replaced by the rich, sweet aroma of the impending dessert service. I stepped over to the custom outdoor bar and picked up a bottle of vintage estate champagne, resting in a silver ice bucket. The condensation dripped down the dark green glass as I wrapped a crisp white linen towel around the base. I walked slowly around the long walnut table, personally pouring the sparkling golden liquid into the crystal flutes of my guests. When I reached my own seat at the head of the table, I set the bottle down and picked up my glass. I did not tap the glass with a spoon. I did not need to demand their attention. The moment I stood up, the table naturally quieted, turning their warm, expectant faces toward me. The jazz trio playing near the pool seamlessly transitioned into a softer ambient rhythm. I look at the people sitting at this table. I began my voice steady and carrying easily in the warm night air, and I see the absolute best parts of my life. Silas smiled gently, raising his glass a fraction of an inch in silent acknowledgement. For a very long time, I believed that loyalty was an obligation of blood. I continued looking around at their faces. I believed that you had to earn your place in a family by twisting yourself into whatever shape they demanded. But you all taught me something entirely different. You taught me that true loyalty is a choice. You taught me that respect is not something you demand through fear or manipulation. Respect is something you build through mutual trust, shared struggles, and absolute honesty. I looked at Valerie, who offered a fierce, knowing nod. Then I looked at David, whose eyes were bright with ambition and gratitude. When I started this journey, I was invisible to the people who were supposed to protect me, I said softly, allowing the raw truth of my past to surface without any lingering pain. But I was never invisible to you. You saw the architect when everyone else only saw the dropout. You helped me lay the bricks of this empire in absolute silence. And because of that, Vanguard Acquisitions is not just a company. It is a fortress. I raised my crystal flute higher. To the family we choose, I propose, my voice ringing with profound clarity. To the empires we build in the dark, and to the absolute undeniable power of knowing your own worth. To the empire, Valerie echoed loudly. To the empire, the rest of the table joined in, raising their glasses high before taking a drink. The champagne was crisp cold and tasted like absolute victory. As the chef brought out the dessert courses, and the conversation sparked back to life with renewed joyful energy, I took a quiet step back from the table. I left my guests to their laughter and walked slowly toward the edge of the sprawling terrace. The thick tempered glass balcony barrier came up to my waist. I rested my hands on the smooth metal railing and looked out over the city of Atlanta. The view from the penthouse was breathtaking. The city was a sprawling ocean of glittering lights stretching out into the dark horizon. I could see the endless ribbons of headlights moving along the highways, the towering illuminated crowns of the corporate skyscrapers, and the quiet darkened patches of the residential neighborhoods far below. I stood there in the warm night air, letting the sheer magnitude of the city wash over me. My mind briefly drifted back to the 20-year-old girl standing in the freezing rain on a manicured suburban driveway. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight of the 2 plastic trash bags holding everything I owned in the world. I remembered the cold, arrogant look in Calvin's eyes as he locked the front door, leaving me to face the world entirely alone. I remembered Brenda's voice echoing in my head for years, constantly reminding me that I was a liability, a disappointment, and a permanent failure. For a long time, their voices had been the loudest sounds in my mind. They had haunted my long shifts scrubbing hotel floors. They had echoed in my cramped, unheated apartments. They had tried to convince me that the sky was falling just so I would never have the courage to look up. But as I looked out at the glittering skyline from the top of the highest residential tower in Buckhead, I realized that those voices were entirely gone. They had been entirely silenced, eradicated by the undeniable reality of the life I had built with my own 2 hands. Calvin was currently sitting in a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, stripped of his legacy and his country club prestige. Jada was facing the total collapse of her career and her toxic marriage, drowning in the bankruptcy she had brought upon herself. Brenda was dialing my blocked number, desperately begging for a return to a family dynamic that had been dead for 15 years. They were trapped in the wreckage of their own arrogance, and I was standing above the clouds. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, fresh air of the summit. I did not feel any lingering resentment. I did not feel the need to seek further revenge. The consequences had been executed, the accounts had been settled, and the heavy toxic anchor of my blood relatives had finally been cut loose. True worth is not something that can be bestowed upon you by a toxic family. It is not something you can buy with a piece of paper from a university, and it is certainly not something you can fake with leased cars and heavily mortgaged houses. True worth is forged in the dark. It is built through silent, relentless resilience. It is the absolute, unshakable knowledge that you can be stripped of every advantage, thrown into the street with nothing, and still find a way to buy the building that locked you out. I took a final sip of the vintage champagne, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I listened to the sound of Valerie and Silas laughing behind me, the warm, joyful noise of a chosen family that lifted each other up instead of tearing each other down. I looked back out at the glowing Atlanta skyline, a city that I now held firmly in the palm of my hand. I am not the family failure. I am not the uneducated disappointment. I am the architect of my own empire, and the view from the top is absolutely spectacular. I pushed my weight against the brass handles and stepped out of the stifling ballroom. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, instantly cutting off the murmurs and the judgment, leaving me alone in the quiet, carpeted foyer. I walked toward the front entrance, the rhythmic clicking of my heels matching the steady beating of my heart. As I pushed through the main glass doors and stepped out into the cool, humid Atlanta night air, I felt a profound, undeniable sense of liberation settling deep into my bones. The performance was officially over, and the real work was about to begin.